I could not believe what I was seeing. I could have filled the back of his head with 5.56, which is an absolute joke.
Well, it's not an ape, because if the Sasquatch was an ape, we would already have one.
What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. We're very pleased today to have Kathy Strain with us. Tom, would you like to jump in and kick this off?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go too far, I just want to say thank you for everybody that sent in the questions. And if you, if you like the show, click like and subscribe, and you can support us, with Patreon, and the link is in the description. And I want to say this is going to be a real treat. Kathy, thank you for joining us and being on the show today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
And the question I asked you just before we went on the air was, I guess you've had an encounter, but also you are an archaeologist for the U.S. Forest Service. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what your job description is?
Oh, sure. I am the Forest Archaeologist and Tribal Relations Program Manager for the Stanislaus National Forest in California. And it means that I am the head person who handles the history, the prehistory, and the living tribes that still use our national forests. And so essentially my job, my other archaeologists, my that work with me, but I'm in charge of them. Before the Forest Service does a project on the ground, like disturbs the soil, cuts trees, those kinds of things, we make sure that there aren't sites in the way, there aren't things that are really significant to history that may get damaged by that activity. And I also assist the tribes that gather plants and other resources off of our national forest. So it really is a lot of fun.
Do you do any historical research into areas where the tribes have, you could say, okay, this particular section of this forest, this tribe was active there, 200 years ago, that sort of thing? Yep,
that's what I do.
Okay. So it makes, I would imagine it makes your job a little easier to, you're saying, okay, you guys are getting ready to disturb the soil or do some digging over there. And how would you go about, do you dig the soil and do you bring a team in there to look for artifacts, or what exactly?
We do something that's called pedestrian survey. So we walk the ground and look for things that we know that occur on this forest. We have a lot of bedrock mortars, which are kind of like grinding cups. Of course, then there's lots of lithics, projectile points, that kind of thing. And, if we don't have very good ground cover, then we might stick a couple of shovels in. But generally here, our soils are pretty shallow. And so, there's enough that we can see the ground that we don't have to usually stick a shovel in the ground.
Okay. And kind of moving in the direction of our topic here, Bigfoot, have you, as an archaeologist for the Forest Service, have you had any, trying to think how to say this, information on the tribes, any of the tribes that you've studied and worked with, current or historically, that points to Bigfoot?
Oh, yes. In particular, I work with the Miwok tribe and the Washoe tribe. And the Miwok have tons of stories about Bigfoot. They have ancient stories as well as modern stories, and I've even been in the field with them. One time we were doing a field check on a meadow, and one of the elders had what he believed to have been experienced with a Bigfoot during that event. And so their traditional stories are tied to landscape features that we have on my national forest or in the general area. And so it's fascinating to study because they have a deep relationship with Bigfoot.
How do the ancient stories, the details of the ancient stories, compare with the modern stories, the modern accounts? And do you see like repeating patterns or information that would be the same in the past as what you're hearing today?
Oh, yes. In particular, I think one of the more interesting things that I've discovered is so the older stories always talked about that there were certain Bigfoots that were good and certain Bigfoots that were bad, and they had different names for them. So a good Bigfoot is Yayali. And I can't pronounce the word that means he's a bad guy. And that actually is the same belief that they have today. In fact, I had a phone call not all that long ago from a guy from the Washoe tribe, and he had seen me on television. And I guess I had never had a conversation with him about Bigfoot, or he wasn't ready to tell me before. But he said, I just want to let you know that, about you have a bad Bigfoot on your side of the mountains. The Washoe typically, they're somewhat on the eastern slope of the Sierras, but Lake Tahoe area down to my national forest. And he said, well, you got two good ones and you have one bad one. And I said, oh, really? And he told me their names. And of course, I didn't have a pen anywhere near me, and so I couldn't write it down. And of course, can't remember anything. And so, and I found that to be very interesting. And I said, well, how do you know that he's bad? And he was just like, well, because they do bad things, and they have a traditional story related to a cave that I have in my forest, where that cave belonged to the bad Bigfoot, and he would eat people and throw their bodies down the cave shaft. And that is actually a true fact. We have a cave, that very cave, and it has human remains that were collected from that cave in the 1960s. And so there's a law called the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. I probably butchered that, but anyway, we tried to give those remains back to the local tribe, and they wouldn't have it. And I said, well, why not? And they go, well, that's not our people. We weren't stupid enough to let Bigfoot catch us to eat us. And so those are somebody else. And so we tried to do DNA, but it didn't come out conclusive. But the age of the remains did prove that they were not Miwok.
Wow. So there actually are good ones and bad ones, and apparently there's a way to distinguish. Well, obviously, the bad ones when they do bad things.
Yeah.
So what do the good ones do?
Well, they can be a protector, and that's typically what I find, and especially in California, that the good ones are the protectors of the forest, the protectors of nature. Bring balance to the earth kind of thing, a healthy forest has a healthy Bigfoot looking after it because he's caring for it. And in a lot of ways, what they believed is that we haven't allowed him to fulfill his role, and that's why our forests are in such bad condition, and why we have these gigantic wildfires and all that goes with it, is because we've kind of cut him out of the cycle of how we manage it. And of course, I always make a funny where, well, if he wants to do the work, I'm more than happy to meet with him and get him restarted on whatever it is that he needs to do. And they just kind of, like, all right, Kathy. But in a lot of tribes, they also believe that once Bigfoot is discovered, that's the end of this age, that a whole new age then starts from that moment. And I've various tribes have told me that equates to the earth ending, or this, we go away. And other tribes have told me, no, it's a higher level of enlightenment that happens when that occurs. So some tribes believe it's really, really bad, and some tribes believe it'll be a good thing.
So just before we got on the air, you had mentioned that you also had an encounter of your own. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. I was in Oklahoma. I had been invited by the NAWAC to an area that they've been doing work for many years, and it's called Area X. And it's not Area X to be ominous. It would they named their research areas, X, Y, Z, and this just happens to be, X. And so they had been telling me about this area for a while, and just can't get away, my kids in school and all that stuff. And one year, 2012, I told my husband, I said, well, let's just make a trip out of it. We hadn't seen his mom for a while. His mom lived in Texas, and we could just make a little vacation out of it. And so we went. It was May of 2012, and it's probably one of the hardest roads ever. And I'm a Forest Service archaeologist, and so we have some awful roads. And if anybody's driven on Forest Service roads knows we have some barely believable that they are a road. And this
I have no idea
really,
what you're talking about.
I've been on a lot, but this road into X was probably the worst road I've ever been on in my entire life. I thought there was just no way we were gonna make it, and then somebody was gonna have to come get us, and we're miles away from any civilization. And thankfully, there were people that were expecting us, and we were going in with one other person that had his own car. So we figured, either way, one way we'd get it out. And so we get in there, and nothing happens the first day. It was just boring, and the second day is where everything happened. And there's 4 cabins there, and we had spent the afternoon running around like a bunch of hillbillies, I guess, but something was throwing rocks onto the tin roofs of the cabins, and you run over to one, and then a rock would get thrown on the other cabin. You'd run over there, and then another rock would get thrown on another cabin. So we're just running around. And I finally got tired of it. I was like, this is ridiculous. We're not going to accomplish anything doing it this way. And so I stayed behind, and I'm just, just talked a little bit out loud. I have kind of a high voice. I thought maybe that could be interesting because not many women go in there. And so we're sitting there, and I'm standing there, and the guys finally come back, and there's 5 of us there total, including my husband. And we sit down, and there's this big old fire pit there, but we didn't have a fire because it's, summer and May, it's hot, and it was still daylight. It was in the late afternoon, and we started to hear something walking, and we thought it was this little fox that you'd like to hang around with us because we give it scraps and stuff. And I look up, and there's this place called the Bottleneck. So this whole area is just overgrown, thick trees. On the ground, there's greenbrier that catches your feet. There's, not much clear land. You have to weave and bob to get through the landscape because you're moving branches or you're stepping over dead logs and all the stuff that goes with that. And I am looking towards what we call the bottleneck because it used to be a long time ago a driveway, but it had since been overgrown with vegetation, but it was still relatively clear of trees. It had grasses and stuff, but no trees in it. And there they are. They're walking right at us. There's 2 of them, a big one and a little one. And I jumped up and I go, there they are. And I start running towards them. And of course, that startled them to get out, and they then turned and bolted up the slope that is behind the cabin like unbelievable. It's like they had been on a bungee and had been suddenly released. From me, they were as quiet as a mouse. They were like ghosts almost, how they just floated as quickly as possible going up that hillside. And there was 4 of us total that saw exactly the same thing, with one member looking towards the outhouse or something. He just didn't see it. So, and then that just started, that whole week was, by the end of that week, I thought I was going to have to go to therapy for all the stuff that happened. It was just constant, something banging on the cabin, making noises, throwing rocks, whistling, tree knocks. It was just a week of just unbelievable activity.
What did your family think about all this?
Oh, they think it's cool. I mean, they all believe in Bigfoot. So they've, outside of, well, Bob and I, of course, have had several experiences. But yeah, they fully believe that I saw one, and they're real animals.
Right. I'm just thinking, if all this activity is going on, I mean, was anybody on edge? Were you nervous?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, at first, after this, I kind of went into this little bit of shock of just realizing that you can't win this, because if one of those, it was a big and a small one, but there's seen bigger ones on that general area. And it kind of dawned on me that if one of those big ones just picked me up and took off, there's nothing anybody could have done about it, because they're as unbelievably fast. They're huge. The ones that I saw, I thought were younger ones. So like the little one, I thought was maybe, what we would consider a 12-year-old, something like that. And the bigger one, I thought it was more of a teenage female. And even then, they were huge in the sense of how wide and bulky and obviously very, very muscular. And so if you got an average male that we think is 7 foot tall, you just can't, you got nothing on them. I mean, they could sweep in, grab whatever they wanted to, and be gone. And you'd just be sitting there going, well, I guess, Kathy's a gunner now, because you'd never find me. And so it was just that kind of shock that kind of was like, well, maybe we shouldn't be here. Maybe we need to go home. But we stuck it out, and I just ended up telling everybody, if you ever find my body, look at my hands, because hopefully there'll be at least a clump of hair in it. I tried to fight, my way down.
Yeah. So you see these two, they're walking towards you, and they obviously they see you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Once I yelled at him, and I ran at him.
And then that sent them they kind of turned heels and took off running. What color was the hair on them?
They were very dark, blackish, very, very dark brown or black. And the sun was on them, and so it was hard to tell the difference, but it was just very, very dark. And they looked exactly like Patty. Exactly.
Oh,
just
okay.
One solid color. And
they're very bulky.
Yes. Powerful. Muscular.
Wow.
Not heavy, not like fat or anything like that, but muscular. So the one, when I got to stopped myself, I started running, so I ended up at the bottom of the slope, and I could see them still running up the hill, and I just focused on the bigger one to take in every detail that I could possibly get. And the thing had put its arms next to its side, and it was doing that kind of marathon runner type of movement with its arms, and I could see the thick thighs with the muscle on it going up into its buttocks, and just, it was nothing but muscle. There wasn't, it was pretty amazing. It was just all muscle.
Now this was your first encounter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is
yes.
a pretty, that's absolutely incredible, a very significant one. Have you had any other encounters?
Yes. So I had the following year in 2013, Bob and I were so wanting to have that experience again, because it was just, even though we were traumatized, it was just worth it, in the sense of having that experience. So the following year, 2013, we agreed that he would go with a friend for 3 weeks there, and I would stay and watch the kids. And then when he would come back, and I would go for 3 weeks while he watched the kids. And so my first week there, I was sitting on the back porch just trying to catch a breeze because boy, was it hot. It was June. And I saw this tree branch wobbling, and I was like, oh, okay, well, there's something on that branch. And I saw this dark black, I thought it was a chimpanzee. I literally was thinking to myself, I'm at the zoo, there's a chimp, a small chimp on that tree branch. And I said, yeah, it's going to jump over to the next tree. And that's exactly what this thing did. And then I got, Kathy, for crying out loud, there's not a chimp loose in Oklahoma. That's ridiculous. And so I said, oh my God, I just saw this baby Bigfoot in this tree, and this is where it went. And we ran down there, and we were just so slow compared to these things. It had already moved so far along. All you could do is see all the other tree branches that were still bouncing up and down, that it had, basically it was running through the trees, And later on that week, one of the other members of the team saw the same thing.
Yeah, they are absolutely incredibly fast. It's as if what I've described was the motion was, it's almost like it's over before it started. They're just,
yeah.
What do you think? How do you think it's just because they're out in the wilderness or they're in the wild, they're constantly moving, so they're going to be very naturally athletic and muscular? Do you think that's pretty much the reason why they're so quick and agile?
Oh yeah, I mean they're built for their environment. I mean, all animals adapt or perish. So you have to have the best qualities to live in that environment. And so the need to think about how far they likely walk in a day just to get the resources that they need to survive. I mean, that's for humans. Humans don't walk 20 miles in a day. I mean, maybe there's some that do, but very few of us. And so an animal that has to walk that far is going to get skills that we don't have. And part of that adaptation is, they have that flexible foot so that they can, go up hillsides a lot easier. They're all muscle because they're constantly moving. They probably, the food resources that they have are not fatty at all, but they provide the protein that they need to survive. But you may have to travel, 3 miles one direction for one thing, 3 miles in another direction for something else. And so, yeah, I think they're perfectly adapted. And for us, we're not surprised. Our brain is so wired to see things that we know. We don't like seeing things we don't know. And so I think if they probably could in a burst probably be extremely, extremely fast. But for us to see something that looks like us be so fast, I think that's part of hurts our brains to get us all wrapped around it, because how is something on 2 feet that able to do the things that they're doing? And it's just how they evolved. They evolved to be the best of the best of the best.
Yeah, and that really makes sense. And that's a good point, because you see these creatures that are 1,100, 1,500 pounds, and you'd think they'd be lumbering beasts, and they're anything but. They're very quick and very agile. Yeah,
and it's I equate that to I won't use any names, but there's a gentleman that I know that's a little bit more on the heavy set side, but Lord, you get him going and he is unbelievably fast, and so it's just deceiving, that what you think of somebody should be able to do or some animal should be able to do, and then when they exceed your expectations, and it's your brain that's going, what? I didn't expect that.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. What came first for you? Did you believe in Bigfoot before you saw it, or did you have to see it? What evidence and what brought you to the point that you said, okay, these things are real?
Well, I am probably one of the weirdest backgrounds. I only became an archaeologist because of Bigfoot. So when I was a little girl, I saw Legend of Boggy Creek, and I just was instantaneously fascinated with what this thing was. And my family is originally from Texas and Arkansas and those areas, and so we would go there a lot. And so I kept thinking to myself, oh man, every time we go out in the woods, we could have this opportunity. And so around, I think it was 5th grade, I asked my teacher what I had to do to study Bigfoot for a living. And she said, well, I'd go into anthropology. That's probably what it is, like an ape. And I said, great. And so that's the path I started on. I was like, oh, I'm going to be an anthropologist. And I figured it out. Nobody was going to pay me to study Bigfoot. The rest of science didn't believe in it. But it was always interesting whenever I had a biology or an anthropology class. There was always at least one page dedicated to the Patterson-Gimlin film. They would always conclude it was a hoax, but it's interesting that was always included in those scholarly books. But because I was already on the path of anthropology, I already loved it. It was already a natural fit for me because we were always, my family, when we went on vacations, we went to national parks, national forests. We never went to like Disneyland or any of that stuff. We were always camping and driving to the next historical site or all those things that go with it. So that's the way it ended. I mean, it ended up well. And I also was born and raised in Porterville, California. And the Tule River Indians have a reservation above the town and in the foothills above the town. And they have some rock art there. And I saw it. So I think I saw it in high school, as I recall, but nobody told me what the pictographs were about. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I was up there with a professor, and she told me, oh, they have these people believe in Bigfoot and this is their creation story, and pointed the stuff out. And I still even have a photo of that day that we were there. It's actually kind of amazing. And so I said, oh my goodness, Native Americans believe in Bigfoot. Oh, this is even better. I can mix, the two. And so I always, when I would meet with tribes as part of my job, during breaks or whatever, I would start asking questions, like, so do you guys believe in Bigfoot? And if you do, can you tell me about it? And that's just how I kind of mixed the two all my life, is that fascination with that. If Native Americans believe in Bigfoot and they have all these very old stories and these old pictographs and stuff, why doesn't science pay attention to that? Why doesn't the rest of the world go, of course Bigfoot's real? Even though I haven't seen one myself, what are these people doing, making this up? And so so that was my path of how I got it. So I had believed in Bigfoot since I was probably 7 or 8. And then it took all that time for me to then actually have my own experience.
What about have you done any studies where tribes all throughout North America have a word for Bigfoot, or a story, a legend, a lore of Bigfoot long before the time of mass communications? Have you looked into that at all?
Yes, I actually have a book about it. It's called, now it's going to jump out of my head. I can't believe that just happened. It's Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, Bigfoot and Native Culture. And it's a collection of stories from throughout Canada, Alaska, and all of North America. And it's the traditional stories associated with the tribes based on what we call cultural area. And so, like the Plains is considered a cultural area, this southeastern part of America. And then there's an appendix at the end that has the traditional name, tribe and what the word means. And so there's hundreds of different names that tribes have.
Yeah, and I find that interesting because, again, this predates, it goes back not centuries, but millennia.
Oh, yeah.
There must have been
and
something.
That's something you have to think about, is that if all these tribes were describing the same animal across the entire United States, that's not, they didn't invent an animal here in California and somehow get it spread to the thousands and thousands of Native Americans that had different languages. It's not like the Yokits could tell, one person something and then hope it gets all the way over to the eastern coast and we all be united in believing in this creature. I mean, that's just ridiculous. They talked about things that were in their environment, animals that were there for them to see. And traditional stories are meant for teaching. They're meant to pass on through time what values the tribe has to the next generation. They didn't have written words, and so the story lays out what they're wanting to save to make sure the next generation has the same belief systems. And most tribes, they supported smaller groups during most of the year, and then the winters when they all came together to be in the main village, because that's when you start, you can't hunt or do much in that time period, and so you're coming together in the winter time and then telling those stories around the campfires.
So, quick question regarding your current employment. How does the Forest Service, do you have any kind of feedback or trying to think how to say this, but do you have any official position as a Forest Service employee on Bigfoot? And if somebody was to walk into, I'm assuming you probably work in a ranger station or something, somebody was to walk in and ask a question, would you be able to go in and say, well, here's what I know, and that sort of thing?
Oh, yeah. My bosses know that I'm on television. I'm on a series on Friday nights called The Proof is Out There. They know about that. They approved the book. And I often get that somebody comes to the front desk. I work in the main office. And so they probably get a little more of this up in the higher ranger districts. But they go, this guy's got something to say. And I go, okay. And I go down and talk to him, write down his name. We've had many, many emails come in. They could just come into our regular Forest Service website and they forward all of them to me, and I take care of it. And we've had some pretty good ones. Just before COVID, this poor man and his son had a horrible experience. Just scared the bejeebers out of them. They were hunting and they saw a Bigfoot in an area where we get a lot of Bigfoot sightings. And decided, oh man, we can't do this. And they started to basically freaked out, was throwing all their stuff in the car. And one of our rangers happened to come on and said, oh my goodness, are you okay? What's going on? And they go, oh my God, we just saw this thing happen and just, we can't stay here. And he was able to give them my name and said, when you feel like it, please talk to this lady. And they called my house, and I was just like, and so my husband talked to him and wrote down everything that happened. And the guy, that poor guy, I still feel really bad for him. He goes, I'm never going back in the forest ever again. And my husband was like, no, really, this is really rare for you to see one. I don't think you're going to have this experience probably again. He goes, oh no, something will happen to me again. And so, yeah, that's not, it's common knowledge on the forest. And I've even gotten a couple calls from a neighboring forest as well, where they go, well, we don't know what to tell you here, contact Kathy.
That was my next question was, do you ever, because you're federal, so it would be quite okay for other districts, even outside of the state of California, if they wanted to, I'm assuming, contact you for information. And what do? Do you take a report? Do you write it down?
I take a report and I write it down, get their contact information, and If it's close to me, I'll likely take care of it. But if it's in a location too far away from me, then, and I know a lot of people, I try to pass it on to somebody in that area, because these are the ones you want. You want the ones that just happened, not the stuff that was 40, 50 years ago. You want the, oh my, this literally just happened to me this afternoon, or yesterday, this is what happened. And so I pass them on, and it's interesting that, the variety, but they tend to come in, at least for my national forest, in certain areas. So like for one summer, we'll have a whole bunch of activity in one area, and then it'll be like 5 more years before that area comes back up again as having a lot of activity. So kind of like it moves where I'm getting all the calls from. Like one year it was Cherry Lake. I got like 7 or 8 calls about that. Then I didn't have any for 3 years. And the next big wave was up at Clark Fork. And it was like, that's so far away from each other. That's a good 50 miles in distance. So, how is that related? And then one year, gosh, Donnell Lake was the worst. We got like 30 calls about that one, because there was something just making people's lives miserable. That was the mean one, I guess. But he was routinely tearing up camps, throwing rocks at people, causing commotions at nighttime where people couldn't sleep. And that only happened that one time. All the rest of them were just regular encounters where, you happened to see it, that kind of thing. It wasn't as scary. So
what do you guys do in the situation where you have one of the mean ones tearing up camps? I mean, what's your response? How do you deal with that? You don't have an animal control officer go out there and.
Well, it's interesting because community word of mouth is probably the most effective way, where we just kind of get it out where, maybe this year that's not the place to go. And interestingly, there's this one place on this forest where even my own ranger, I guess you'd call him, he told me never to go there. He said, oh no, we had so many problems there that essentially they just kind of let the road get slightly washed out so that people would think twice of going into that area. And then of course, that just makes me want to go, in there. And I think we took Cliff Barrickman with us when we went in there. Nothing happened, but he was pretty adamant about, just don't go in there, because he said the devil lived in there. So
have there ever been any reports of people being injured by one of these things?
No, not that I have ever received. Most of them are just, that sudden sighting, and you're scared, and they ignore you as much as possible, or maybe they're just going through the area and it's a brief encounter. So I would say no, I never have had one of those come to me.
Okay. And we've heard reports about them coming into areas, I'm thinking about even here in Oregon, where they would cross a river and go into the campgrounds and ransack the garbage cans. Have you guys, any reports of that? Have you guys ever heard of that?
We definitely had some activity near a campground that it was actually very interesting. There was a bunch of tribal people there at that campground that weekend, and it was kind of like fortuitous in my mind, and something started to make a ruckus, but it sounded like they were trying to tear into the trash cans, and one of the elders said, Yaya Lee, go away. And I guess, according to the people that were there and told me this, all the sound stopped and they didn't have any more problems. So that was their traditional name for him. And so they just kind of hinted to me that just by speaking his name, that would cause him to calm down.
Yeah. Well, you're the second person that has said that. We have a guy up in Canada, Native American or First Nations, who's kind of said the same thing, which is interesting. But they can understand nominally what we're saying.
I wasn't there, but I just had the tribal members telling me that that's what happened. But that area before had some problems, even years ago, of having lots of Bigfoot sightings and activity. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that happened.
Yeah. Now, you talked about sometimes the Forest Service will let it. That's going to take a little bit of time, maybe a season or two. But do you know if the Forest Service ever says, all right, look, this is a bad area, we're just going to cordon it off with, logs or boulders or dirt or anything like that?
Not due to Bigfoot, no. Because it's in general, most national forests are open to camping wherever you can get to. And so we have, areas that are unsafe because of other reason, of course, have blocked those off because maybe there's the road is gone and you'll die because, you didn't see it coming as being gone, but not due to Bigfoot. Now, we discourage, if there's a problem going on that we think is bear or Bigfoot or something else, we just discourage people from camping in those locations. We suggest other areas for them to go.
Ah, interesting. And bears do. I have been camping when bears come in, and they definitely ransack the garbage cans and the picnic tables, incidentally.
Yeah, and they do. And one time we were doing a project in the forest, and I had one of my, there was volunteers, and we were doing archaeology. I should caution that I don't do Bigfooting on government time. So if somebody wants to talk to me about it, then I go off the clock. Or if it's very brief, I'll tell them I'll call them after hours. So I just want to make that very clear. But we were out doing this project with volunteers, and I had one of the volunteers in the middle of the night thought she heard something. And the next morning, she had made a bunch of boiled eggs for her time. We were going to be there like 4 days, and something had opened up her ice chest and had taken all but like 3 eggs, left her at least 3, kind of thing, and had gotten the lid of her ice chest back down perfectly without getting any dirt or anything. So we knew it wasn't a raccoon. And we figured out later that it was a bear that had done it, but I really teased her pretty hard that a Bigfoot had gotten into her ice chest and was considerate enough to leave her some food. And I mean, she was not happy with me. She couldn't sleep for 3 days.
But she's okay with the bear doing that, right?
Well, we made her then move her ice chest because we had told everybody you have to keep them in the bear safe lockers kind of thing. So, but we don't have bear. I know there's a lot of people that are really, really scared of bears, but we really don't have bear attacks. They don't tear up tents or any, unless you keep a bunch of food in there, then they'll tear into your camp. But our bears are not going to kill you. They're just not interested in humans as food. They're interested in your food.
Every time I have an encounter and here in Oregon, that's where I live, we have black bears, that's it. Mm-hmm. Is you usually see the back end of the bear as it's scooting away because it just knew that it discovered that you were there, and poof, they're gone.
Yeah.
that's typical black bear.
I've seen a lot of bear in my time because we have a preserve, a hunting preserve, so you can't hunt in there, and all the bears have figured it out. That's where they got to go. So.
And they are smart. They're animals. Yeah, they figured this stuff out. And I got to say, I love bears. Black bears. They're to me. I saw one recently crossing the road. Just a real cute bear. Very nice, silky, clean coat. Nice blonde snout. Just a typical black bear. Just a real treat seeing them kind of galoping across.
I love all wildlife. So except for snakes. I hate snakes.
Snakes?
Yeah.
I almost grabbed 2 rattlesnakes by accident one time, and it's a long story, but I didn't. Nope. I was glad, and I went 8 feet straight in the air. So have you had any other encounters yourself besides the ones in Oklahoma? What about anything in California?
In California, I've had seen footprints. And one of the funniest one, I've had two that were both when I was doing an archaeology survey, and I said, "Whoa, what in the world is this?" And so that kind of was, startling in the sense that it was obvious that something had crossed in this area just before I had gotten there, and I could never figure it out where it went, because it seemed like that was very fresh, but it didn't matter. They moved obviously faster than me. But I've heard tons of howls. California, at least my experience is they communicate through howling. And in particular, we recorded the Lake Tahoe scream that sometimes they used to use on finding Bigfoot, was recorded in the Lake Tahoe area. And I worked with a witness to get that, because there was just so much of these howls and screams going on in this area. And for me, it was because they were trying to communicate, and they had to get up and above the din you could just hear in the faint background of the casinos and stuff. But this was in the mountains that surround that area. And here in Sonora and most places that I've Bigfooted in California, the howls and the screams are fairly common, as well as wood knocks. And so those have been my primary experiences. So I've never had a sighting in the state of California. All my sightings have only been from Oklahoma.
I got to say, it's kind of encouraging to hear you talk about the howls, though, because that's hands down. I mean, I've only seen them one time, but I've heard the howls, and they're unique. There's nothing remotely that sounds like these things. No,
they're very distinctive.
Yeah, very distinctive. I heard and another one, I imagine they do it in California as well, kind of a scream bark, just a very, like a burst of scream and a bark all at once, lasts about a second and a half. Arr, arr. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't heard that one. And then I don't know if you know this or not, but the Sierra sounds, Ron Moorhead, that was actually recorded on my national forest. So that's where they were camping. And so we kind of have a long history of these experiences, but I have not heard that. And I don't know what I would think about that if I heard that. The howls are bad enough as it is.
Yeah, they're the scream barks. My wife and I were camping, and we heard those about 2 a.m, then again about 3 a.m. And yeah, it's it's interesting. And the dogs, some dogs in various camps heard it as well. So I'm like, yeah, I got witnesses.
Well, yeah. Oh, and that's kind of interesting too, because like I said, my children were raised basically. I have one that's very enthusiastic about Bigfoot, and another one that he hates it when people come up to me and talk about Bigfoot or anything. It just drives him crazy. And, you're always going to get, one kid's always going to be different. And a long time ago, we actually lived in a different house, but I got tired of us having to shovel snow. And so I said, we got to move to a different elevation here. But one summer we had the window open, and my oldest son heard those howls. And he goes, Mom, that sounds like it's just coming up the hill, and he kind of pointed to where he thought it was coming from. And that ended up being quite a summer for that. We found prints. We found what we thought was a nest that had just been constructed. These are little, you'd have a house on like 5 acres, and then the next house would be, on an acre, and it's all got Forest Service and trees all over the place. And I started putting flyers out, putting them on, billboards, or putting them on, the power poles of, have you guys been having any experiences? And I just got flooded with people complaining about something howling, something doing this, something doing that. And so I started an operation, essentially just at nighttime, I'd go up there and we take turns, rotate people, just sitting up there and getting what we could. And that was an interesting summer. We had lots of howls, and then it never happened again, and it still hasn't. So it's very odd. There's got to be some seasonality or some sort of pattern that we're not recognizing, that a Bigfoot might come through an area that he's been to before, but maybe it's been 5 years or 10 years because he's got a way that he moves through the landscape, or something to that effect. I'm talking to a person now that it appears every spring or every fall, maybe it's every fall, he's having something come through. He has a remote piece of property and he's found prints, but it's taking all of the apple trees off the tallest part of his tree. And so, or plums, was it plums? I don't remember. And I think it's apples, but it's happened now twice in roughly the same time period. And, the tree you have to be 7 foot tall to get to the top of those apples. And so we're in contact and we're going to be testing this to see, can we predict when he's going to come back through the area? And the prints were clearly Bigfoot prints. There's no doubt about it.
You touched on something that I wanted to ask, and that is, you're an archaeologist, so, I want to ask about physical evidence, bones, if you've seen any bones or heard of bones, or if you've been in contact with people that are, maybe lateral positions in other ranger stations throughout the country. But before I get to that, I want to ask a little bit about the nest. How did you know it was a Bigfoot nest? Can you describe it?
Sure. It was, well, I can tell you, I can't prove that it was a Bigfoot nest. I just suspected that it was because it was so unusual. It was a large tree bent over. So can you imagine like you're taking the top of a pine, but this one wasn't a pine, and you're taking it and you're putting it over, and then there was this big, huge rock that had been moved. I found the location of where it had come from, and it was set on the end of this tree to keep it from flapping back up and being a tree. So it was making sure that it was a curved structure. Then there were sticks that somebody had come through this area previously and had done some pruning or done some sort of work, and there were some dead branches. So the smaller branches of the tree, of pine, had long died. So these were kind of old, like probably 6 or 7 years old. So they were clean of any other leaves. And whatever it had done, it had taken these sticks and wove them through the bent branches of the tree to kind of create a windbreak or a shelter or something to that effect. And inside, where you could crawl in, they had taken fresh fronds of trees, had taken the smaller branches off, and then created like a pad down at the bottom, something to lay on.
Interesting. Now, when you're looking at this shelter or whatever it is, did you see any Bigfoot like footprints or any other signs around there?
Yeah, there was a print. That's how it went right to the structure, and so thinking that I had the opportunity to get some website in Tuolumne County, and you can see the pictures and stuff that's on there. I documented it with photographs, and then we excavated the pads down at the bottom, hoping we could get some hair or something from that. But it ended up that I don't believe it ever got used because I think we interrupted the process of it being used. I mean, I think it was very, very fresh in the sense, and nobody got to use it because we found it too soon. And after it gets found, my stink was all over it because I went inside and was, excavating it. And so I didn't get any hairs or any other evidence to suggest what had constructed it.
No, it's very interesting. Have you do you talk to any other people, either in the Forest Service or BLM or any of the other land management agencies, who have an interest like you do and kind of, pursue that interest?
It's getting more than it used to. In the old days, nobody would really talk about it, kind of thing. But I think it's just like you see more Bigfoot things on television and stuff. It's getting to be more accepted. The only interesting thing I ever had versus, another employee is we had a very, very large fire on our forest back in 2013. And I was in the field dealing with the fire when a Fish and Wildlife Service person was in our office, and he was there to, talk about, because we have some threatened endangered species, and he was talking to our biologist, and he asked to speak with me. And our biologist went, well, why do you want to talk to her for? And he goes, well, I want to talk to her about Bigfoot and what, just tell her a few things, and that let her know that, us and Fish and Wildlife Service, we're ready. When they prove this thing is real, we're going to move on it and make sure it gets its protection. And so I never got to talk to him because I was in the field. But the biologist relayed to me what the person had said, and I was actually quite astonished by it. I was like, he told you all this? Because it just says, job protection, don't want anybody to think you're crazy. But yeah, he goes, yeah, this guy was just like, he really wanted to talk to you. And I said, well, if he comes in again, just let me know, and I'm more than happy to talk to him about it. So that's the only time I've had that I can think of where somebody, I get general questions, and, employees go, oh, you're Kathy Strain, you believe in Bigfoot. Oh, great. Well, that's cool. But nobody who said, as an agency person, I'm willing to pursue this and make sure that, we do the best science for it. I've never had anybody else do that.
I think it's interesting, though, that somebody else did contact you.
Yeah.
Well, listen, really appreciate the time tonight. And if it's okay with you, we'd like to chat with you briefly once we're off the air. So,
Sure.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. And folks, stay tuned for the next segment.
In Bigfoot history, near Orchard, Washington, early 1960s. A man from Orchard named Lopez told Roger Patterson while driving home on a foggy night with his head out the window of his car, he drove slowly around an obstruction on the road. It turned out to be a jet black creature, 8 to 9 feet tall, with a flat face and no neck. It just looked at him as he went by. Welcome back from the break, everyone. I don't know where Milo is yet. He hasn't responded, so he must have something going on. But I wanted to bring up something first of all, before we kind of get going, that's really interesting. We've talked about the Minnesota Iceman in past episodes. I just got a book called Neanderthal, the Strange Saga of the Minnesota Iceman, written by Bernard Heuvelmans. And it's actually very interesting. I haven't read a lot of it yet, and I want to bring this up to you, Forrest, maybe for our next, you can inform us about this. He and Ivan Sanderson were discussing. He went to see Sanderson, and that's how when they learned about the Iceman from somebody that Heuvelmans knew, or one of them knew. But anyway, they were talking about the different possibilities of what it could be. This is before they actually went and examined it. And they were talking about, somebody could have gotten a chimpanzee corpse, and they could have stretched it and done all these bizarre things to it. But Heuvelmans, he points out, he says, all of this was perfectly possible, but Ivan seemed to have forgotten one point. As I pointed out earlier, there are no clear-skinned, large chimpanzees. I've never really heard that. Do you know about that? What clear-skinned means?
Well, he's probably referring to the pale skin. You'll see that sometimes on young chimpanzees, and their faces will be pink skin rather than the darker skin. As they age, they get darker, and then it's kind of the reverse thing, that the older they get, you'll start seeing the modeling on their faces, where it actually is. It's kind of like us when we start getting age spots on our faces. Their age spots are actually lighter, and it's like a white spotting all over their face. So you can oftentimes tell the age of those, and even macaques do the same thing. That you'll start seeing this white round circles appear on their faces.
It was interesting. He was discussing that, if somebody had such a specimen, either an albino chimp or even better, an albino gorilla, it would have been much more effective to just display that than making all these, crazy changes to a body. And they were talking about stretching and, fingers and toes and all these things to make this bizarre thing. I just thought it was an interesting point.
I don't know how they do that.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, they said it would have been a real artwork of taxidermy if somebody had possessed those skills. And then it's just, and Tom brought up a good point. We were discussing it. You want to go with the path of least resistance if you're going to do something, right? So why would you go through all of that effort to create some fake that you wouldn't really benefit a whole bunch from?
Well, I think that's an awful lot of trouble, and I don't think that you're dealing with an individual. I don't know that much about the man that encountered the Iceman. He's from the Air Force.
He was a captain in the Air Force, yeah.
Yeah. I've seen the pictures that in your book. That's not a chimpanzee. That's not a gorilla. That's not any monkey I've ever seen. And it does bear a striking resemblance in the head to our Neanderthal, recreations. You get a lot of these places that do the wax recreations of for the museums and such. And I'm telling you, it does bear a striking resemblance. But we have never, ever found any remains of Neanderthals in the even in North America or South America. But you know what? Who's to say that they didn't come across that Bering Strait along with a lot of other things?
Yeah, exactly. So, and I remember, and I spaced off his name, the guy who wrote, Danny Vendramini, who wrote the book Them and Us. And he had an artist do some work with Neanderthal skulls to do a creation. And that's something people should note. When you see pictures out there, artwork of Neanderthals, those are artist interpretations. It doesn't mean it looked exactly like that at all. It could have been very different. So what Vendramini had done, it was very different than what the conventional, appearance of Neanderthal was. And that's what even Heuvelmans, he titled the book Neanderthal. And it could very well be, this, what we call the type 4 creature, could very well be a Neanderthal, relative or what have you, instead of what we think of as a Sasquatch.
Exactly. And you see, you hear all of these observations by people saying that it looks so human in the face. And I don't care what you say about Neanderthals. People call them, think that they were knuckle dragging, cavemen. But, I go back to what I've said before. You know what? They were here on this earth a lot longer than Homo sapiens sapien has been. And I don't think they ever left. And, God, I'm going to say something that somebody's probably not going to call in and get me for, but has anybody ever really looked at a lot of Eastern Europeans and their facial features? I think they share a lot of facial features like Neanderthals, and that's not being said to as a slight or anything else to Europeans in that case, because they're finding out that all of us, with the exception of people from Africa, and even some of them actually have had some encounter and inbreeding with Neanderthals up in the northern regions. But most of your southern Africans don't have any type of Neanderthal in them. So it pretty much shows you that Neanderthals exclusively, they were designed for cold weather, and so they weren't wandering around in the warmer climates. And that's not somebody's going to think that I'm trying to say that they're slow-witted or something like that, because that's not it at all. Those people were around for a long time, and I don't think they ever left. That's my personal opinion.
Right, and there's a couple other points in there too. I mean, and you're right. I mean, they had, first of all, the skull cavity was about 200 cc's larger, I believe, than humans.
Larger, yes.
So they had larger brains than us, considerably larger. I think that's would equate to about a third larger than ours. So
exactly.
They're not stupid, or weren't stupid. And as far as the features go, that would be based off from skull morphology and not opinion, right?
Right, exactly. And I think Tom and I'm going to interject something here. People, they hadn't expanded their technology as far as points and such as that. But if you don't really need something, you're not going to try to develop something better.
Absolutely.
And Tom and I talked about this once upon a time. Tom, remember about the Mayans? He said, well, they didn't have the concept of the wheel. And I said, oh, but they did. They had wheeled toys. The Mayans had wheeled toys. They knew what the concept of the wheel was, but they lived in the jungle. Of what use would a wheeled object or wagon be for them in the jungle?
Right, that'd be for more open ground.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm curious. I do have a question, just kind of a hypothetical one on the Neanderthals. So they're a northern climate, cold climate hominid. Would they, and if there's still some around today, maybe they're the type 4s. Going back when they were more dominant on the Earth, do we have any anthropological evidence of what how did they live? In other words, are there parallels between their living habits in the past and what they would need to do? Could we see anything like that today? In other words, the bedding, the food, that sort of thing.
Well, first off, the few fossil finds that we do have of Neanderthals are usually grave sites. And, we realize that they did have a probably extensive culture of religion, because there was one grave site that they found that they had actually placed red ochre on the body, and then there was flowers on there. Well, that tells you right there that you're not dealing with a dumb, just a dumb, stupid caveman. They have a culture. Now, sites in caves are going to be more readily available to be found and studied, and that's where they usually find all the, well, as far as I know, all the skeletal finds have been found within caves. To find something like that out on the open, prairie lands and savannas of their time would be probably next to impossible. I mean, they have since discovered that when the glacial period was with us in how many thousands of years ago, that all of that land out off of Spain and France and even all the way to Great Britain, all that was connected. And I'm sure that was, your mastodons and your mammoths were grazing animals. They ate grass, and so all of that was all savanna and grassland. So their mammoths being their primary source of food would have been out there. So I would think that they would have probably established shelters and villages, whatever or groups. I don't know how, we have no idea how large the groups were, but they would have been out there on those areas. Well, those have since flooded back, and there's no way in the world that we're going to be able to, find the sites out there now. But I mean, we know that they took care of their elderly. They have a skeleton that, and this is actually where some people got the idea that all Neanderthals were hunchback, was that they found a skeleton, and the man was actually he had arthritis, and he had arthritis so bad that he was partly from injuries, because these guys suffered injuries like what you see on bull riders from these large Pleistocene mammals that were taken down. I mean, they were hardy people, more so than anything we could ever, live through. But this man was just absolutely riddled with arthritis, and he was hunched, and they took care of him. So you're talking about people that were caring, and they had the same human emotions as we do. And I don't know what else to say about that, except that what you're going to do, and that particular time, they're going to be looking at caves for their habitation area, and not so much out in the open plains either. So, because of that, most of the finds are going to be in caves, and they have been. And, I mean, they're still excavating caves in France and the coast of Spain.
I would think, too, that because of the cold, harsh environment that they thrived in, now they might not necessarily have favored caves. That's just where the remains have been found. They may have been out on the open savannas, but because of those harsh conditions, scavenging would have been on a much larger scale, let's say, than in more favorable climates for animals. And had they died out there without being buried, they would have simply been scavenged and scattered whatever remains was there, and there's no fossilization. Well,
and even if you buried your dead out there, so many of those areas where we surmise, and it's just, it's all, we don't really know for sure, but we surmise that they did their hunting out there in those areas. It's all underwater now.
Yeah,
and,
right.
I mean, they obviously buried their dead. But who's to say if a mammoth came down on top of a guy, I mean, they would have to literally butcher the thing to get to him, possibly. So, somebody might have been left there. But, the act of fossilization, you've got to have absolutely the perfect conditions.
Ideal conditions. Yep.
Rarity of hominid. I don't even know what they call them anymore. Hominins,
right.
Hominids.
They keep changing it.
They can't make up their mind. And I was actually reading an article here that a friend of mine sent me that, when I went to school, it was Australopithecus afarensis. That didn't even exist. It was Basile in the robustus form. Now they've done away with that, and it's afarensis. And now they come up with another one saying that, oh no, there's another variety of Australopithecus.
Good
so
Lord.
You know what? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. I don't care how smart you are. You can study these things for eons of time, and nobody knows for sure how the exact tree of evolution went.
Well, and John made a good point when we brought that up one time. He said it's not so much a tree; it's more bushes.
Yes, exactly.
So you have things developing at the same time, but in different areas, not necessarily connected to one another.
Exactly. And there's so many gaps in that tree trunk and the bushes and everything else and nobody knows.
Huge
and
gaps.
There's only I think there's probably 26 individuals that we have that we can even call our ancestors, and we really don't even know if they really were our ancestors, but they do exhibit features that we have acquired, and so who's to say?
We even
our forefather was.
We even kind of John and I threw around the idea of, in that record, because they want to say, well, all of these things are, pre-human ancestors. Well, what if they aren't? What if the ancestor to the Sasquatch is actually represented in there? And one good candidate was the Australopithecus robustus. And
exactly.
and I thought that looking at the fossil photographs, and John says that was his idea too. So we don't know.
Well, now like I said, I try to keep up with this stuff. There's been so many things that have just been discovered since I went to school, and makes me feel really stupid. But I was reading an article on one that they had found in Tanzania, and they're now thinking that maybe the acquisition of walking bipedally didn't occur because, always the theory was that when the savannas started developing and then the trees started becoming more sparse and farther apart, that was what prompted man's ancestors to climb down from the trees, walk bipedally, because, let's face it, on the savannas, that is an advantage because that way you can see above the grass.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the thing that prompted man to do that. Well, now they're saying that maybe it was more like what the orangutans do. I don't know if you've ever watched, orangutans can brachiate beautifully, but they will grab a branch and they will walk across tree limbs.
Oh, sure.
And so now they're thinking that maybe that was what was how bipedal walking developed, that they learned to walk across bipedally on limbs, and then as their arms got shorter and shorter, then they were able to get down and actually walk on the land.
Lots of ideas.
It's going to be a long time before anybody's going to know the truth.
Oh, yeah, if ever, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to comment, though. Interesting, the fact that the Neanderthals buried their dead. It's like they did rituals, with flowers and the red orca.
Yeah. That indicates to me that they had some concept of either an afterlife or that's a loving gesture to the deceased. And these are not cold-hearted, non-feeling beasts. And a long time they've gotten a bad rap for being that way.
Yeah, it shows
so
thinking and caring.
Sometimes, yeah, you get this idea that they grab their women by the hair and they drag them around, and I don't think it was anything like that at all. Not at all.
It's interesting, too, with the Sasquatch. There are a couple of stories out there, and I think they were native stories where supposedly creatures were seen with a dead individual and buried it. Not a lot of ceremony or anything, but the fact that there were 4 or 5, living ones with a dead one, and then they proceeded to bury the individual. I think that is a possibility.
Well, I'm going to tell you something. Y'all know I raise horses. What we do when we have a mare that loses a baby, and I had my vet, who's just about, I consider one of the smartest men on the face of this earth, Dan told me to leave the baby in the stall with the mare, and he said, and watch what happens. And you know what they do? They take the sawdust in the stall and they cover that baby.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yes.
I've heard that they grieve.
Yes, they do.
They'll gather around in a group.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, elephants do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and elephants always want to go up and touch the body, and they'll move their trunks all over the body. Well, horses, I've seen them do the same thing on when I've had one of my old mares just lay down and die, and you'll have all the others coming around and sniffing all over, and they'll just stand, and a lot of times they'll stand there with her. Yeah, I had an old mare that actually died in the field here a couple of years ago, and that's how I knew she had passed. I mean, we were feeding, and the other horses wouldn't come in; they were all there with her.
I think in a lot of ways we tend to underestimate the intelligence and like you said, the feelings of animals because they don't speak our language, and so we can't get that sense of intelligence. But I think if you look at other clues, even cats and dogs are just very, very intelligent.
Well, I think I've told you, Tom, that about cats. A little known fact about cats is that that the cat's brain is formatted exactly identical to how our brain is formatted.
No, I did not know that, but that explains things.
That explains a lot of things, doesn't it, Tom? You and I both being cat lovers.
I send Tom a lot of cat jokes, so.
Right? Yeah, they're good at manipulating people, too.
They are. Oh, well, there's an old adage. Cats rule and dogs drool. Cats have slaves and dogs have masters.
That's it.
Right? Well, I like them both.
Well, I do too.
Well, Tom, I know you got some questions from listeners, so you want to go ahead and bring one of those up?
We got a bunch of them, and then Forrest, you and I talked about a situation that I think we're going to discuss too if we get time. But this one is from Moran in Canada, and this is specifically for Forrest. He says, "I was wondering if you could explain to me, in regards to Sasquatch, how they may have gotten so widespread and what they could be." So a couple of questions in there. He says, I've been putting a lot of thought into this, and how is it that they got so widespread across the world? Because they're down in Australia, for crying out loud. I mean, that's its own little world. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, heavens. Well, they're kind of like most primates. They got the wanderlust, I guess. Look at humans. Who would have thought that we would spread all over the world like we did? And we did. And, whether we want to admit it, our racial types are actually based on adaptations that we have developed in those regions that we remained in or maybe originated in and then spread from. So the same thing is with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yowie, Yeti, whatever you want to call him, Yowen. They have slowly spread across the world. I mean, they took opportunities just the same as any other type of mammal did and moved into other areas, whether it be pressure from other groups or predators or what that causes animals to move. And they took, advantage of those areas. And that's why I think you have the slight variations in them when people describe them. I mean, your Yowie, it sounds like a Bigfoot, but there are some different differences in Yowies and our Bigfoots. And then there's difference in the Yeti, and there's difference in the Yeren, and what is it, Alma, what they call them in Russia. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's all they're all basically the same animals, but there's slight variations.
Yeah,
and I think that represents adaptations to the area that they have acquired through those thousands of years. And it doesn't take that long. All it takes is one mutation, and for that mutation to be a dominance in the gene pool, and there you go. It's just like blue eyes. They have traced blue eyes in the world came from one individual.
It's interesting. I get asked that question periodically about the variations, and I was told through my source there are 22 variations here in North America alone. And it makes sense because you get varying witness descriptions from location to location. And a good one that I like to use is when we look at the Pearson film, that creature is very, very muscular. It's built for mountainous terrain. You go east of the mountains here on the West Coast, and it's pretty flat and open. The ones that are seen there are mostly, they appear the same except they're more slender. They're more designed for open ground running instead of the bulky muscles for mountainous terrain.
Longer and leaner.
Yeah, same creature, two different variations.
Right. And then you get your swamp ape down in, or skunk ape,
Right.
whatever you want to call it, down in Florida, and you've got the descriptions that you get from that area are not anything like what you see in the Patterson film.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, we adapt to where we're living in, the area that we're living in, and the conditions that are forced upon us.
Next question, Tom.
Okay, so I'm going to jump into the question for us. This is the one that you and I talked about. Will, you're familiar with it. And there was a person that was, I think it was in 2019, had they died here in Southern Oregon, but it was kind of gruesome. They were found at the bottom of a ravine. Actually, their pants and I believe shoes had been taken off, and something had gnawed on their intestines and also, their reproductive organs. And this is something, Forrest, I asked you about because chimps have behavior like that. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is correct. And you'll see that there's not a whole lot of film footage out there of chimpanzees fighting, but if you ever get the opportunity to look at it, the first place they go is for the facial area, the groin area, and the stomach. The stomach being the fact that they can rip those intestines out, and your opponent is completely at your mercy. The groin area, they do that. The males do that when they're fighting, because if you can destroy the reproductive region of that male, well, he's done for. He's no longer competitive with you. He's going to go away. If he recovers, he's not going to be coming back to be breeding the females, and more than likely, he's probably going to go somewhere and die. They do that when they attack humans. They go for the facial regions. They will rip a person's face to shreds, and then they will, if it is a male that they're going after. I've not ever heard of them doing this with a female, but it would not be uncommon to have heard that they went for the stomach region of a female. But I know that female that Oliver attacked, her face is unrecognizable to this day. I mean, it was, and she's had numerous reconstruction surgeries done on her face. But they go for the groin area, and they can certainly do some damage because you've seen those canines on them. I have not ever seen a gorilla do this. Most of their, I told you that gorillas avoid, bloodshed at all costs. They are really the gentle giants of the forest. And with them, they have got some sets of canines on them, but most of the time you will see them it's an open mouth yawn type, and they will use those for display of aggression, and it's usually whoever's got the bigger set is going to win they will come in to have tussles, and every once in a while there might be a little bloodshed, but it's not going to be a battle to the death. Now, with chimpanzees, that's an entirely different situation. They are, people say, how can they be that way? And, I've said over and over and over, well, look at humanity. Chimpanzees share nearly 98% of their DNA with us. And it's only that slight 2%, I think it's 2.7% that they have that we don't have, that makes us the naked ape and them the hairy one. So, trust me, I think culture has made man evolve into a slightly nicer version, but sometimes we know that doesn't always work out so well either in our society. So I think we're seeing a lot of that right now in the news. But
what come to mind was Carol talking about the lady who talked to her was knocked out and her intestines being eaten by the Sasquatch. Kind of goes right to exactly what the point is.
Mm-hmm. And you see that in a lot of these deer kills. Now, I've never personally seen one, but I've heard y'all talk about it, and I've heard it talked about on a lot of other shows where they take and kill the deer and then rip out their intestines and eat. They're going for those organs that are rich in vitamins and all that, like hearts and livers, and that's what they want, and not necessarily the meat itself.
It's interesting about the vitamins. I'd mentioned going with a witness up here in Northern California a few years ago to a location where he'd had some sightings a few years previous, and he didn't think the creatures were still there, but I found fresh markings within hours of them being made, about 4 feet of finger drag marks in some clay. And we talked to John, our forensic anthropologist, and he says, oh yeah, that a lot of animals will eat clay for the mineral content.
Oh, yeah, they do. And buffaloes, deer, elk in the wild. I mean, I used to have, when we would drive up and down the Alcan, I would have, well, if we stopped to get gas or something like, it was nothing to have moose come up or even elk come up on the road into these gas stations, and they would lick the dust off of the car. And I thought that, I even asked one of the guys around there, I said, that's kind of peculiar. Why would they be looking? and he said that particular area along the Alcan, they have a what they call a mineral lick. And he said, oh, yeah, they go up in there and they eat the clay off the cliffs. And he said, and you driving up and down that road, they have salted the road, so they're getting the salt out of the dust and such off of your truck. And I went, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. And there's caves in Africa that elephants will make long treks to, because they have salt mines down inside these caves, and they will go in there and they will, I mean, it's not like the salt is just there. They actually eat the clay and such that has the salt in it.
That's interesting. I actually found one other spot like that, out doing my field work. We were up pretty high up on an elevation, and it was here in Northern California. We stopped and I was out looking at this area, and we found this spot not far from the road, where not a well-used road, not many people up there, but it clearly looked like if you were to take your hand with your thumb up and wipe away the surface of the dirt, and it revealed clay underneath, maybe a quarter inch or less. It was very light surface, but the clay, and then there were clear finger marks that were dragged a few inches in that clay. So it's what made me, when I saw the one here just a few years ago, I mean, these, the finger markings were about inch to an inch and a half wide, and they were clearly 4 of them drug 4 feet in this clay about an inch deep. I still kind of kick myself for not taking plaster and casting that, because it was so interesting. But I've actually seen this a couple times now.
So they've been neat if you could have gotten some fingerprints and such.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting, too. The first time we found footprints when I was 14, what led us to that was finding animal intestines lying between the rails on a railroad line. And there was no sign of the dead animal, and we found Bigfoot tracks very close to where this was.
Strange.
Yeah, it was very odd.
I can't find if animal intestines just does not hold any appeal to me, but that's not to say.
Well, when you're a kid, you see this stuff. I grew up on a farm, so I was used to that kind of stuff. But at the time, I thought, well, how in the world did this get here? Because there was no footprints anywhere. But when we searched the area just above the tracks, there was a raised area, kind of like they'd built the tracks through a hill, and right on top of that, it was if, and you could see where something huge had set down in the snow, and there was a fist print, and there were footprints all over the place, and it was almost as if it reached out and had dropped some of the intestines onto the tracks.
Here's a question, Will. I never thought of this until just now, but did you ever find what the intestines were from? In other words,
No.
did you find carcasses?
No sign of an animal at all.
Hmm.
I assumed they sat there and ate whatever it was. But I just don't know. Now, my friend John, it was more than a few years later, we were in high school then, we used to have a trail between our house and went through the woods. And that's how we would get back and forth most of the time to see each other. And the last time that he went and used that trail, he took my dog with him for company. And he found a deer that was killed up just inside the trail area. And the neck had been twisted, broken, and it was open in its midsection. And it spooked him so bad he hurried up and went home. And my dog, he said my dog acted really funny around it too.
I want to ask Tom a question here just a second. It just suddenly occurred to me. Tom, when we were talking about the other individual, and you know who I'm referring to, that with the groin and the stomach ripped open, was his face intact? Do you know?
His eyeballs had been removed or eaten. But that's all I know. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any more information than that.
But
they
he have
did.
his upper clothing on?
Don't know. That I don't know. They didn't mention one way or another. Several months later, because it was a mystery what had happened to this person.
Exactly.
It came out in the news that they had solved the mystery. It was a bear that had done all this.
Always a bear.
So, well, it's the bears. I'm telling you, they're far more capable than we can possibly imagine. And but
it always went the other direction. So anyway,
right, and they're victims too. So I don't know what the deal is with that. But and then I guess they had assumed that maybe birds had peck the eyeballs out, which is a possibility.
Well, that's a possibility, yeah. Uh-huh.
And in the news, they don't give all the details, usually. So it could have been a very different scene than what they were portraying.
I know, and only people like you and I and Tom have a morbid interest in what did he actually look like?
Well, we had the way we found out about it was there's a few telltale profile points in the whole situation, and Lee, who we know well, called up and kind of alerted us to this, and in his typical very cordial demeanor.
Facetiously said.
Right. Well, we won't even go into that, but he brought up some really good points.
Well, it makes you just want to run right out there in that area and go hunting, by yourself.
Well,
if you want to be a sasquatch, maybe, but
it's an area of high activity. And I was just listening to, she's actually read some of your books. Lynn Smyth.
Oh yeah.
Was reading. She was reading the story from that exact region. Some kind of spooky stuff going on. So she put that out today. So we like Lynn, so we like to cross promote.
And what she's been reading are from my two Witness of the Unknown books, and what those books are primarily are people will send me, because a lot of times we get people who want to relate their story, but they won't either record or they're just not interested in talking about it, but they'll write it out. And I'm working on the third volume now. I'd still like to have about 25 more accounts, because they're usually not very long. But it's very interesting where somebody will have an experience and they'll relate it in their own words that way. But that's where that comes from, what she's reading.
Well, some of these accounts, just like me telling you about the incident in the cabin, I had talked to Chuck before I wanted to tell y'all. I said, because I kept thinking, Chuck, are they going to think I'm a complete nutcase? And he's like, no, go ahead, tell them, because that's something that you need to tell them. And because that is something that happens quite readily and far too often.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people think
I'm going to
too.
get my courage up to tell Tom.
Yeah, a lot of people, it's really difficult for them to discuss what they've experienced because of that reason. It's like, well, they're going to think I'm crazy. No, we don't think you're crazy. We hear the same elements time and time again.
Right. And that's a key point is, these repeating patterns, and the stuff that happens is so outside of the, as Will said, outside of our frame of reference. It's way outside the ordinary. That how do you explain this? I mean, how do you explain that you woke up, you had a can of pork and beans, bump your hip, and you've got this, massive injury on your head. The door's open, and the house reeks of musk. Well, you take all that information in its totality, and what does it point to? Well, it really only points to one thing.
And we have a couple of examples that are similar. We have the story that T.W. told about his friend John and Carol's incidents.
And Brenda.
Oh, Brenda's got some good ones. Yeah.
So there are repeating behaviors.
Okay, we got a question from Tony in Australia. And by the way, I want to say real quick, I just want to do a kind of a promote this book. We have a couple in Australia, Will, that we had on the show a while back, and they sent you and I a copy of the Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot.
It's a great book.
Oh, it's amazing. So again, thank you very much to that couple.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is just a fantastic. It's a good resource. So we have Tony from Australia, and incidentally, the author of this book is Tony. I wonder if it's the same person. Anyway, Tony wants to know. He says, "My question is, has Will managed to stay committed to the Bigfoot subject over the past 49 years?" And what drives you to continue the search for answers?
It's funny when you look for answers. I've heard other people say this too when they've done something a long time. The more answers you get, the more questions it brings up, and those questions sometimes drive me crazy, and I have to answer them. So I keep delving deeper and deeper into this.
It's a puzzle.
It is, and you're trying to assemble. It's like, okay. Many years ago, people today I'm sure don't do it a whole lot, but people used to build puzzles many years ago, and it's like, you've got 1,000 pieces, so you're trying to assemble this thing, and usually you got a picture to go by. This subject is you're trying to assemble the picture with no picture to go by, with just these small pieces. And a witness account is a microcosm into these creatures' daily routines. So it's very difficult putting this together, but as you assemble more and more pieces, you get a clearer picture.
And Will, I go back to this time and time again. You saw the bloody entrails, and your friend's dad. Was it John's dad who came out with a pistol?
It was John's dad, yeah.
Okay, and so he's telling you guys about this thing called a Bigfoot, and I know your response because I'm a guy too. It's like monsters.
Well, we were
in my backyard
when we were, that age. We were 14.
Yeah,
we were 14, and you like in those days we liked the old Frankenstein and Dracula movies and all that stuff, right? So that was cool. So when somebody's telling you there are real monsters out in your woods, it's like, wow, I get to go look for real monsters. Not thinking of the consequences, but and we didn't see.
I got to tell you, and that's with me today. That's the intrigue of this whole subject is, wow, it's and somebody once said, to those who seek adventure and knowledge. Who was that?
Can't imagine.
Yeah.
I'll tell you though, I've gotten to the point with knowledge in this that I sometimes I have that same feeling, but it's equally balanced by kind of a feeling of dread because I know what these things do and why they do these things. And it kind of creeps me out a little bit sometimes when we're in the field because, you're always looking over your shoulder wondering, do you got one of these nasty ones or a group of nasty ones, and what are they going to do? Or, that's why when we went in September, I'm looking at all the small signs. Our friend who was with us, we won't mention his name, but he was sort of poo-pooing that. And I told you, I said, you have to understand the small signs so you know what they're going to do.
Well, and he does know. He's experienced with the creatures, with their dark side, and it always cracks me up. There's they're called Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and he's actually got some other vernacular. Yeah. that we can't mention on the air.
Right, rhymes with truckers.
Yes.
The vernaculars might actually fit him better.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sometimes.
Right. But, he and all of us, I think, immediately realized that we were being drawn into an ambush situation.
It's funny in that term.
We left the way we came.
Yeah. Usually it's funny. I was going to mention.
Is that the one, Tom, where y'all started very quietly backing out of there?
We got out of there quickly.
Yeah, very quickly.
Okay.
we jumped in the trucks and left.
Just before that, we held a kind of a democratic meeting, which it was unanimous. It lasted about 10 seconds. Yeah. If that.
It's funny, Tom. He calls them that. My terminology, I usually don't refer, at least in private, I'll say hairy bastards. I don't use the Bigfoot or Sasquatch. These hairy bastards.
Right.
Well, mine's we just call it's the hairy man around here, and Jessica uses that term, Sherry, everybody. It's hairy man. Was hairy man here? Have you seen hairy man?
That's what Alaska natives refer to him as, the hairy man.
Yes, I know. I had a native friend up in Alaska, and she actually told me some. She says they're real. They're real. The natives have known about them for centuries.
They have some very
I guess
bad.
As an anthropologist,
they have
as an anthropologist, that's what first frustrates me. Is because do you think all these natives throughout all these hundreds of years have just been making all this up? And I get so tired of these white, and I use that loosely.
Mm-hmm.
Anthropologists and archaeologists saying, it's mythology. It's mythology. Well, you know what? Usually most mythology is based on, facts somewhere.
Right. I had to laugh. I think back to when I first started college after the military. I'd been a sergeant, and, sergeants in the Army are generally, you don't really care about what somebody else thinks a whole bunch. So I walked in the first day, and my anthropology professor was also the head of the department. And I walked into his office, asked if I could talk to him. So I sat down in front of him, and I kind of did a Renee to him, and I sort of pounded on the desk, and I said, what do you think about Bigfoot? Just right out in his face. And he looked like somebody kind of smacked him, And he says, but he was very open-minded. He was a great guy. And we chatted about it and quite a bit. And, he didn't have much to offer, but I said, I'm here to learn about anthropology because of this. And that's the reason I went in that direction academically. And it has helped quite a bit.
Well, yeah. And I was lucky because my first anthropology professor was actually Indian, and I'm talking about East Indian.
Oh, wow.
And yes, and he told us stories about yetis. And,
they've got extensive stuff.
Yes, he actually had seen one as a child, and he thoroughly believed in it. And Bigfoot, and and he was my inspiration because I thought, well, this is a man that's got a doctorate, and he's smart, and he believes in this stuff. It's not something that's made up. He's seen one.
There's a really interesting book, and it was written in 1955. I think it wasn't published till a couple years later, but written by a man named John Keel. And about his adventures in that region, North India and Nepal. And there's 2 solid chapters in there where he actually pursued a yeti until he saw 2 of them. And it's really interesting. And the locals all, when and I can't remember the word I used, their name for it, but when it came up, they were all terrified. And I actually got that from a friend who works in New Delhi. He's from Liverpool, but he works there, and he knows, of course, a lot of the folks down there, especially some people from the Indian military, and they're all very matter-of-fact about it, and locals are terrified of the Yeti today.
Yeah, they say the military don't even want to go into the areas if they know that they're...
They don't. And it's interesting, my friend, he said, he said the tiger population is making a huge comeback, and it's primarily due to the Indian Special Forces because they're the ones that sort of handle the poaching situation there. And he said their method of handling poachers is that if they think somebody's a poacher, they just kill them on the spot. But if they get word that a yeti's in the area, they will not go there.
Uh-huh.
And the yeti come in and take however many people they want to, and then they leave.
Huh.
Just sort of matter of fact.
You know, you think about it, it's in a sense, it's almost like an undeclared battle or war situation between humans and the yeti or Bigfoot or what have you.
It's probably always been that way. You know, I've talked to Indian friends here who've told me, oh yeah. And in fact, the one friend I had from Klamath Falls, he said, these things were here before our people came to this region, and we drove them out of the hunting areas. He said that's why they live up in the high mountainous areas, because we drove them out. You know, indicating that.
And they'll probably be here after we leave.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, some of the things. And I'd mentioned to Tom, we were discussing yesterday about some of the different Indian beliefs. And I was contacted when I first wrote Notes from the Field back in 2003. I was interested in using some photographs of Native American artwork, and it was specifically the masks, ceremonial masks, that represent the Sasquatch. And so I contacted some of the galleries in Canada that displayed these for sale, and I asked if I could get written permission from the artisans to use that in exchange for, you know, getting them some exposure and hopefully some sales. And they all responded very positively. They were all very nice people. And one of them wrote back, and he was identified himself as a chief and an elder of the Haida tribe. And he says, very specifically, he says, be careful what you hear from different native sources, because it will depend on their experience with the creatures, both current and historically. He says, usually, you know, we have friends from the Flathead tribe and, you know, Fred in Alaska, and the ones who have the real direct contact with them will tell you they're man-eaters. Don't mess with them. The ones who have the more flowery descriptions don't have a lot of experience. It's more their ideas about the creatures. He says, so you have to kind of learn how to distinguish the difference.
Well, that would make sense, though.
It does, yeah.
Well, the thing, too, when you were talking about the mask and such, you know, people are always saying that they're in and I've seen the totems, actually, where they have them on the totems, and you see them with the pursed lips and
the whistling. Yeah, that's how you identify which one is the wild man. Did we lose Forrest?
Sounds like it.
Oh, all right. Let me call her back. Sometimes calls get dropped, folks. Let's see. But yeah, that was how you identify them. And it's not just the pursed lips. I mean, you know, we have a good friend who made a mask carving for me, and it's there she is.
I'm back.
We lost you, but yeah, the pursed.
Where I went to, but I'm back now.
the pursed lips are whistling, and that's how you identify the Sasquatch in native carvings.
Well, that's what I was told, that they were whistling, but I might beg to differ there, because have you ever seen a primate when they hoot? How they do their mouth?
Yeah, right. The same posture.
So exact same posture.
But we do know the creatures whistle. I'm not denying that. No. But yeah, that's a good point. I never really thought about that.
Yeah.
And I've heard them make the hooting noises. It sounds like chimps. We were outside of Mount Rainier, a bunch of my old friends from high school, camping up there just outside the park boundary. And one of the guys says, hey, do you hear that? So we stepped away from the fire, and above us about 100 feet on a steep slope, you could hear two. One was making kind of a funny chattering noise, and it was moving back and forth, you could tell, and it sounded really agitated. The other was hooting exactly like a chimp.
Mm-hmm.
It was the weirdest set of noises I've ever heard, I think, in the wild. And coincidentally, it was an area of a lot of activity with these creatures.
Yeah, that'd be rather disconcerting to wake up to listen to that.
Yeah, we just kind of sit there in awe listening to this, and we're like, wow, and then after, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes of it, it went silent. But apparently they were up there not happy with our presence, but they decided to leave.
Huh.
And it could be because there were, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us there, so, we were kind of outnumbering them.
Yeah. I don't think they like to deal with people when they're in groups, but
they don't. No.
One or two, that's a different story.
I wonder how that corresponds to, let's say, chimp or gorilla populations. Is it a numbers game? Do you think with them too?
I think so, and a slight. I'm going to go off track there just a bit, but with all the guerrilla activity in the Congo region and those areas in there that you've heard all the tribal conflicts that they've been having, that they actually were hunting chimpanzees for a long time for bushmeat. I mean, it baffles my mind that you could eat a primate that's really so closely, it's like eating your cousin. But, I digress. So chimpanzees have basically changed their behavior in those areas to, instead of feeding during the day, they hide during the day and they feed at night. Now, does that sound familiar to you in any way with Bigfoot? And pressure from populations have caused chimpanzees and gorillas both to move into less populated areas, and which is kind of bad because it's limiting their territory. And now they're having problems with the chimpanzees warring upon the gorillas, and it's all pressure from humans, taking over their territories, which it's a sad situation.
It is, and I think what's happening with the Sasquatch here is in reverse, because our behavior's changed dramatically over the past 40-some years, 50 years, and now now it's reversed. They're coming into close proximity with humans and doing things they didn't before.
Yeah, because they're finding out that we're a food source to them.
Absolutely.
And I'm not talking about coming in and killing humans,
right.
But we've got livestock, we've got pets, we've got garbage,
yep.
and dumpsters, and look at all that food available.
Oh yeah,
to
we're
them.
easy.
Why do you have to run down a deer when you can go over here to the local dumpster area?
Exactly, and we're not shooting at things like we used to, so we kind of let it happen. We're allowing this to occur inadvertently.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And I would expect to see quite a bit more of that in the future.
Forrest, I want to jump in real quick. While we still got time, there's 2 interesting things. You got some updates, and we just sort of totally forgot about those. But talking about, the creatures having an interest in our garbage and all that kind of stuff. So you had somebody come on your property a couple weeks ago. They saw something, and then recently, you know what I'm talking about with the recycled bags.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Okay. Well, 2 weeks ago, Sherry actually texted me, and she said that, I say texted me. I honestly don't remember now whether she texted me or we actually talked about it. Well, I think we have talked about it, but I can't initially remember how the conversation went. But anyway, her husband had brought her daughter out here to take care of the horses and feed. They take 1 day on the weekend, and then they take 2 days during the week. And then those other days, Jessica's here. Well, Travis was just standing out in the back, the way I understood it, and what attracted his attention was the fact that it was moving back and forth, and it was standing on the opposite side of the fence. On the other side of the fence, my neighbor has let it grow up really, really bad, and in fact, some of his trees during that really hard freeze that we had actually died and fallen over on my fence, and we've been trying to get that cleared out so that we could get the fencing back up. And this thing was standing in the corner, and that's what attracted Travis's attention to it, was the fact that it was swaying back and forth. And after he looked at it for a couple of minutes, it actually just turned and then went off into the brush. And that was basically the end of it, because he just said it went off to the west there, off into the cedars. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, Tom, because you've seen the aerial footage of the property here.
Yeah, I have. And I want to ask you, just your professional opinion, what does the swaying back and forth mean with primates?
Well, swaying back and forth is not necessarily a good thing.
Not a good thing.
No.
Isn't that agitation and aggression?
They're agitated, and they a lot of times they will do it trying to build up their I don't want to say courage, but maybe their agitation to a point that they think that they ought to do something about it. Now, another primate would see that. Dumb people. Another primate would see that and go, "Oh, I'm getting out of here." So, because this guy's getting, mad.
It's part of that ramping up behavior.
It's ramping up a bad behavior, and yet humans look at it and go, "Oh, that's interesting." Well, that's about the time you need to really turn and just walk away.
I've interviewed a number of people over the years that have seen that, and they smartly left the situation.
Yes. I mean, you don't really want to stand there, and you definitely don't want to stare them in the eyes, because then, you really got a problem, most generally. So, but this creature he went on his own way, and I'm glad, because I didn't need something happening back there. But do you want to hear about the story about the recycling?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely do. And real quick, before we do that, the swaying back and forth, and Will, you said you've heard that. Did you also have a family member who saw one and
my sister
terrified?
Yeah, my sister. But it wasn't swaying back and forth. It was actually kind of jumping up and down. But it was like an agitated behavior.
Chimps will do that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, she was driving. Yeah. She was driving home one night in the area we grew up in, or through that area, and at those days there wasn't hardly anybody out there, no real buildings or homes or anything. And she came to this four-way intersection that we knew, and there used to be a little store there at around 2 a.m., and there was the only street light there in the whole area. And right as this creature was under the street light and on the side of the road, and as the car came within 5 feet of it, it was doing this jumping up and down behavior. Scared the hell out of her. She wouldn't tell me for years about this.
Did it have its mouth open or closed?
She didn't say.
Now, see, if macaques, oftentimes when they get into an agitated state, they will, do these little mock charges, and they will roll their lips back and show their teeth, and they've got some substantial canines as well.
Right.
And then they'll do this little hopping, motion forward, and towards the person, the ape that they're, upset with. And then most generally the others will tuck tail and turn. Sometimes they will actually have an interaction, and it can be a bloody interaction with macaques. They will rip each other apart and do some substantial injuries to each other. But
I'll have to ask her.
But they do that. They do that little kind of bouncing motion, and they'll go forward with it and bouncing on their front legs.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to ask her, because I never thought that, and I'm not sure how much she saw it, because when we first found footprints back in 1972, she kind of raked me and my friend Mark over the coals, so the rest of the family, but she was kind of the main cheerleader of that one. And in here, it must have been around 1981. So she had her own close encounter, and it wasn't until, probably another 10, 15 years later before she worked up the nerve to tell me. I think she was afraid I was going to kind of reverse roles, and I didn't. Because I know what I experienced in the same area. And for anybody else that's had the experience, I have a lot of sympathy, for what they go through.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the recycle bags. Give us, what's the scoop with that?
Okay, well, I told Tom about this, and I kind of have to laugh, because it was it was comical in one sense, and then it wasn't in another. I'm a recycle nut. I recycle everything, and well, not everything. Everything that's recyclable anyway. And I had been. I bag up my plastic and I put them in big black plastic bags, as I fill them up, and then we take them into Austin, because Austin now is the only place that we can get them to take plastics. And so I had been kind of stockpiling it, and Sherry and I had gone into town. We got some hay and came back and kind of parked out there, and I was looking, and I said, I really need to get this recycling taken into Austin. It's just really kind of got piled up, and I got quite a few bags out there now, full bags of plastic piled up. Well, the next morning I came out about 7:30 to let my kitties out of their outdoor cat house, and I walked out the back door, and I looked out there, and there was like 3 or 4 of these big black bags. They were thrown into the backyard. Well, now I've had a gentleman here that was putting up my a 6-foot fence around my yard. Well, we won't discuss what has happened to him, because nobody seems to know what has happened to him. He got it 3/4 of the way done, and the rest of it's not completed. So, anything can just walk into my yard, including the horses now. And I thought, well, that would be something kind of strange that the horses would do. I don't know why they would be picking up my, black bags and throwing them around the yard. So I go on around the corner, go let my cats out, come back, and that's when I noticed on the ground, and I always keep one bag on the end. That is, every night I'll go out there and I'll take my plastic bottles, whether it be, I have a Keurig, so I use distilled water. So I've always got, the big 1-gallon plastic jugs to put in there. And so I always keep it open. I tie it at night, but I don't tie it, double tie it, and so that I leave it open until I get it filled up. And I noticed at the top of the bag, that was the first thing I noticed, was that the top of the bag was completely open. I thought, well, that's weird. I remember tying that up last night because I had put a gallon jug in there. And then I looked down on the ground, and here's where this is high strangeness if there ever was. There is a line of 6 items sitting on the ground. First was a gallon jug, and then there was 2 cups, plastic cups from Mojo's, which is the local coffee shop around here. And then there was I think it was a plastic salsa. It was just a clear plastic container, and I think it was originally a salsa container. And then there was a lid from another item in there that was laying on the ground, just this purple lid, and there was like these 6 items lined up there, and a perfect row. I mean, it wasn't like they were just thrown out there or just sat anywhere out there in front of the bag. No, they were in a perfect little line. And
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I told Tom I should have took a picture, but it was one of those things. I looked at that. Then my first thought was I looked around, and he asked me later, did I look for tracks? Well, right there, the ground is pretty hard right there, and I don't. I didn't look for tracks, and I guess I should have walked all around there and looked for tracks. But you know what I did? It was still 7:30 in the morning. I put the stuff in the bag, tied the bag up, and I walked in the house.
We talk about parallel behaviors. When we interviewed Jerry Klein, and I think Jerry's in Ohio, isn't he, Tom?
Yeah, he's in Ohio.
So he was out, kind of prospecting and enjoying kind of a relaxing few days, and he had a little recycled bag next to his RV. Or a container, not a bag, but it was a container where he put his, cans and plastics in while he was out there. And one morning, I believe it was, he went out there and saw that this was disturbed, and the objects were taken out and placed in a line. And when he followed the line, he came on one of the creatures. He came right up to it. So really interesting, almost identical parallel.
Yeah, that is so bizarre. There's just 6 items.
I know the answer.
What's that?
I know what it is.
What?
Yeah.
Had an epiphany.
They're watching us, and you probably had a couple of young ones, and they wanted to play house. That's what it was.
Well, no, here's I just thought of a connection, Tom, between the Bigfoot and the owl noises, and the recycling. See, remember the old commercials, Woodsy Owl. Give a hoot, don't pollute.
Oh my God!
Right?
Oh no!
That's it. We've solved it.
Oh, yeah. See,
all right.
There we go.
With that, we're out of time. We'll leave on that note. So everyone, stay tuned for the next segment. And if you haven't heard the midweek show, we post that on Wednesdays. We call it Bigfoot in History. Take a listen. It's different than what we do with this show. So, folks, stay tuned for the next segment. In Bigfoot history, near Neah Bay, Washington, 1962 or 63. A Neah Bay man wrote to Roger Patterson that a serviceman driving at night to Neah Bay from a radar installation almost ran into a huge beast that was definitely human-like, walked on 2 legs, and was covered with hair. When his lights hit this creature, it bounded across the road in one stride and up a steep slope about 20 feet high in another leap.
Welcome. This is a series of stories being brought to you by William Jevning and being narrated by Jim Sower. Story number 1, Australia. Bigfoot spotted in bush near Sydney, April 15, 2009. Australian News, April 2009. 2 backpackers on a year-long trip around Australia got the fright of their life last week while they were out trekking in the bushland in the vicinity of the township of Leura, not far from the well-known Katoomba landmark, the Three Sisters. It was early evening, and by the ladies' own admission, it was a bit late to be by themselves in the bush. Ingrid Schoen, 23, of Germany, and Addie Hansen, 22, of France, decided to head back into town when they heard the breaking of branches and loud footsteps heading towards them. Ingrid turned on her torch to light the track in front of them, and at this point they both claimed to have seen what they now describe as Bigfoot charge away into the distance. Admittedly, we did not get a close look, but we think that what we saw looked like the American Bigfoot, basically covered in hair and about 2 meters tall. It definitely had no clothes on and was not human. Ingrid told All News web reporter Jaden Cassidy, "We were petrified and almost lost our way back in our nervous state," Ingrid commented. The Blue Mountains is believed to be the home of a creature known as the yowie, basically Australia's version of Bigfoot or the yeti. There have been many recent sightings there. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, local Aboriginal tribes were certain of its existence. Aboriginal communities still living in the Blue Mountains, along with some other locals, continue to believe that the yowie might be out there in the vast expanses of Australia's Great Dividing Range. This is the end of the first story. Story number 2. BBC's Online. So Weird, Lionel's Guide. The Ape Type. They're all big, they're all hairy, they're all colossal cocktails of man, ape, bear, and occasionally goat, but they're all over the world. Yeti in the Himalayas, Sasquatch and Bigfoot in North America, Yaren in China, Nguoi Rung in Vietnam, and the yowie in Australia. Most of the time they're more frightened by the spotters, but they're not always harmless. An adventurer named Bauman was working as a trapper with a friend in the Wisdom River area in Montana. One night, when Bauman got back to camp, he found his friend dead. There were huge bite marks on the body, and the man's neck had been snapped by something with far more than normal human strength. A few days before the tragedy, they had both seen a strange humanoid creature which they reckoned was about 7 feet tall. And this story was reported by President Roosevelt, so it must be true. American presidents don't lie, do they? In 1924, Al Ostman claimed to have been abducted by a whole tribe of Sasquatch. He was asleep in his sleeping bag when one of them picked him up like a rag doll and carried him away. As the creatures made no attempt to harm him, Ostman, who always kept a loaded rifle by his side when he was out alone in the wilds, did not wish to harm them. He finally got away by giving snuff to their leader and running away while the Sasquatch chief was sneezing uncontrollably. Many disturbing reports of the Yeti, or abominable snowman, a close cousin to Sasquatch and Bigfoot, have come in over the years from the Himalayas. In 1974, on a plateau 14,000 feet up near Mount Everest, 19-year-old Lakpa Sherpani was knocked unconscious as she tried unsuccessfully to defend her yaks from a yeti which killed several of them by twisting their horns until their necks were broken. This story comes to us from BBC Online. The end of story number 2. Story number 3. Alaska Magazine, September 1998, Volume 64, Number 7. Nathan, the Brushman, by Velma Wallace. Sasquatch, or something like it, appears in the legends of the northern Athabascan Gwich'in people as Nathan, the Brushman. Is he a myth, a monster, or a lonely man? The Nathan was held in fear and admiration, although none could swear he ever actually saw one. If someone dared say that they did, people laughed, yet some believed. It is said that the Nathan, also called Brushmen, were men who were ostracized from the group for disobeying tribal rules. The rules of the wandering Gwich'in bands were simple and stern because survival was their main concern. The rules helped the people to survive their harsh environment, but they also were social requirements meant to keep peace. Some men, and occasionally women, did not abide by the rules, so the band leaders would ask the person to leave. The condemned person usually tried to prove he could survive without the group, but isolation taught otherwise. Physically, survival was possible. Emotionally, the human craved companionship. The rejected person would find himself slipping into the guise of a Nathan. He would hover behind bushes, spying on people. If he became lonely, he tried to kidnap a woman and sometimes succeeded. Others saw Brushmen as non-human, but with human appearances and magical powers. For instance, the Brushman possesses the ability to use mind power to lull you to sleep and then steal your loved one. Even after contact with Western culture, the Gwich'in people believe that the Brushman still exists. In the late 1800s, an infant was said to have been stolen by a Nathan and later returned. Although the Nathan was feared, he also was romanticized. As a teenager, my mother often wished that she were stolen by a Nathan. My husband told of a time when he hunted above the mountains in Chandlar country, and large, dark, and dressed in skins, this thing appeared from the woods and knelt down to drink water from a stream. Jeffrey called out to him, wanting to believe he was just another hunter. The startled man looked up and then ran away. Jeffrey told others, and they laughed, for what was the typical response to anyone who said that they saw a Nathan. Despite people's skepticism, not long ago a sensible couple traveling down the Porcupine River spotted a man walking alongside the beach. When he heard their motor, the man disappeared into the willows. The couple searched the area, but found only moccasin tracks. Later that fall, in Fort Yukon, meat and fish that hung on drying racks were missing. People said it couldn't have been dogs because there would have been tracks, and camp robbers Gray jays, blue jays, and stellar jays always leave a mess. Again, even in modern times, the myth of the brushman sends excitement through the heart of small Alaskan communities. Perhaps the spirits of those long ostracized and rebellious individuals still do roam the land, searching for food and companionship. Copyright Alaska Magazine, September 1998, Volume 64, Number 7. That is the end of story number 3. The Legend of Ohio's Orange-Eyed Creature, 1959. Old Orange Eyes was allegedly an 11-foot-tall, 1,000-pound Bigfoot creature that is said to live in central Ohio, on a lonely road called Lover's Lane, where it stalked teenagers. The Orange Eyes creature first gained notice on March 28, 1959, when 3 teenagers observed a huge, hairy orange monster rise from a ground fog at Charles Mill Reservoir, near Mansfield. Then, 4 years later, the beast appeared again, and this time it was witnessed by several people. Scientists were not sure where this creature lived, but it is assumed that the beast might have lived in a tunnel in Cleveland's Riverside, where it lived in peace for more than 25 years. Then, suddenly, in the 1940s and 1960s, highway construction destroyed the tunnel that Orange Eyes was alleged to be living in, forcing the creature to live in a stretch of forest behind the Cleveland Zoo. Finally, a group of teenagers invaded the creature's habitat on April 22, 1968, and chased the creature armed with baseball bats, flashlights, and ropes, and went into the forest to try to capture and kill the creature, but they found no sign of the beast. June 1991, Old Orange Eyes appeared again, and this time the beast ran past 2 people fishing near Willis Creek, scaring the daylights out of them before disappearing. It was said the way to find this creature was on Ruggles Road near Blue Ridge, and if the creature was there, it would appear curious. Witnesses of the orange-eyed creature say that there is no monster, just some crazy hermit or trademark feature by nailing 2 round orange bike reflectors to a stick, or teenagers using Christmas tree lights, flashlights, to frighten one another. Courtesy Andy Ramirez, Saturday, June 23, 2001, 10:38 a.m. This sounds like an urban legend, and it may also remind you of the Big Head report from Richland County, Ohio, vintage 1978. This is the end of story number 4. Story number 5. Biddeford, York County, Maine, 1951. Suddenly, there he was, less than 15 feet in front of me. I am a 73-year-old man, and when I was 13 years old, I was on a holiday with my parents in Biddeford, Maine. It was a sunny, chilly day in April. I told my parents I was going for a walk along an estuary leading out to the ocean. When I came close to the flowing, chilly water, I saw a winding stream with sandbanks rising 5 feet in front of me. As I climbed up on one bank to look at the water a few feet in front of me, I saw a figure floating on his back, coming in with the tide. I'd say we spotted each other at about the same time, so I had just stepped up onto this dune from the land side. It was 4 or 5 steps, and I was on top of the dune, looked down at the water, and there he was, right in front of me. I can easily think about that moment, and again, I had no idea what I was looking at. I could see him so clearly, even his hairs as they swirled around his body. Now, mind you, at this time of my life, I had never heard of yetis, Bigfoot, or never read about them. I never knew they existed in my 13 years of age. This figure had the shape of a man with grayish hair and a hairless, pinkish to reddish face with no hair on it. Although I had read about Bigfoot through those years, I never put the two together. I guess one reason was that this guy had grayish-white hair, and I guess I didn't really think he was a Bigfoot. This guy had no breasts that I could see. Only while reading about Bigfoot recently did I notice that you'd see a whitish-gray one that would appear. So I got excited, and I had to write about it. The rest of his body had hair which moved as the water washed around him. He was on his back and floating in head first. He was no more than 12 to 15 feet from me. I didn't move one bit as I gazed at him. His arms were to his side, and he lay motionless, but the incoming water was moving him along this creek at about 4 miles an hour. His body was barely awash, meaning that he was floating on top of the water with about half an inch of water covering his body, except for his pinkish-reddish face, which floated out of the water. I'd say from the front of where his ears should be to the front of his face. His nose, eyes, and mouth were out of the water. His facial skin looked wrinkly. Not a lot, but he had mostly deep wrinkles on his face. Another thing about his face, the skin was bare, not even a whisker, no hair at all on his face. One more thing, the amount of his facial reddishness was like a sunburnt man. He showed no facial expression. Only his eyes moved over to me, and that was a little scary to me, but I stood there and stared back at him. I don't think I shared any expression. About the hair, it was about 6 to 8 inches long and loosely floated around his body. It looked like it was the consistency or thickness of a golden retriever dog. Not thick and matted like other Bigfoot reports that I've read. I did notice his knees, hairy, slightly bent up, and still just below the water. While I was watching him, I saw no effort to move his hands or arms. He easily drifted in without any body, arm, or hand movement that I noticed. I'll never forget how I felt during the brief time that I saw him. It was a deep soul connection that overcame me. I felt peaceful and calm during the whole time. I think I said this guy was about 12 feet from me, maybe even a little closer. I want to go back to where I saw him someday in hopes of connecting with him or his children. I thought it would be hard for me to walk down the little dune and follow him, and I don't think I would have, since the dune led into the water, and I thought I would have gotten wet. Besides, I was so startled I could only look at him. Having never heard of these creatures, I ran through my mind every creature I had ever seen, and this didn't exist in my vocabulary of known animals. I was always interested in animals. I never ever saw anything like this. As I was gazing at him, he looked up at me, and we had an eye-to-eye connection, which only lasted a few seconds. I can't say for sure, but I think his eyes were grayish-blue in color. He felt kindly to me, not startled, and I wasn't either. I will never forget this moment, and it's clear as a bell to me after 63 years. I ran home to my parents, who were in a house along the beach, and excitedly told them what I had seen. Well, they didn't pay much attention to me and thought I had seen a seal or a walrus or some other sea animal. I never thought much about it and kind of forgot it after many years. Later I began to hear and read about Bigfoot and never put what I saw together. The reason was that all reports I have read, these creatures were never grayish-white, and they weren't very tall. This guy was only about 6 feet in length, no more. But finally, about 10 years ago, I realized that this might have been a yeti. What else could it be? I feel a deep connection to the Bigfoot, and my experience will always be with me. I keep my sighting almost to myself, but though what I saw might help in some small way, tell others to help understand what's going on. You may publish this and use as you wish. You may use my first name, but please keep my contact information private. BJ, from Maine. Sunday, March 13th, 2011. That's the end of story number 4. Thank you for listening. Welcome. This collection of stories is being brought to you by William Jevning and are being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Story number 1. Grand Marais, Cook County, Minnesota, 2011. Snowmobilers spot Sasquatch in Superior National Forest. My sighting occurred in Minnesota. The nearest city to the sightings is Grand Marais, Minnesota. The sighting was in the Superior National Forest on January 29, 2011, around 3:30 in the afternoon. The area has many lakes, and this sighting was near a tributary to one of the lakes. The nearest road to this area is Gunflint Trail. What I and my sister saw that day was incredible. We were snowmobiling in the back country of northern Minnesota when my family and I were approaching a downhill section of the trail we were on. There was a clearing on the hillside above us where there was a break in the trees. As I began my descent on the trail, I happened to look up and spotted something in the clearing about 200 yards above me. My sister and I were at the back of our group, so we both slowed to a stop to see what caught my attention. When we looked at what I saw, we observed a tall, man-like creature watching us. It stood there for about a minute, then reached up, grabbed a branch, and walked off into the trees. The creature we saw was maybe 7 feet and was dark brown in color with darker areas around the face and chest area. It had long arms and a very human-like appearance with a high forehead area. We grew up in this area and know the local wildlife extremely well. This is not a bear or moose. We have never seen anything like this before. My family has been somewhat skeptical about the sightings of these beings, so when we saw it, it really frightened us. Sorry, no photos because I was on a snowmobile and it is rather hard to carry a camera in an easily accessible place. We circled around and could see large barefoot tracks in the snow. The snow is so deep in Minnesota this year, so it was hard to get close enough to get any pictures of the tracks. But you could definitely tell that a two-legged creature passed through the area where we saw it. I wish I had more evidence, but unfortunately I never dreamed that I would ever see something like this, so it really stunned us. My sister doesn't want to go there again, but I would really like to go back in the summer to see if there's anything to be found. This definitely made me a believer in Sasquatch. We did not report it to any authorities for fear of being ridiculed. My sister and I wish to remain anonymous for this same reason. But we would like the rest of our story to be shared so that others will know that they are not crazy if they see one of these creatures. Anonymous, in Grand Marais, Minnesota, February 2012. That's the end of story number 1. Story number 2. A story out of Siskiyou County, California, approximately 1996. My name is Mark Kennedy, and I have a good story. It happened about 10 years ago while a crew of 12, including myself, was working a contract for the Forest Service to clear a couple miles of wilderness trail. I believe it was our first night at this particular spot, which was an area in the north end of the Trinity Alps. It was about 26 miles into the wilderness zone of the Trinity Forest. Camp was about 5 miles off the road in a beautiful meadow with a small lake called Red Cap Lake. We were done with our second day of work on this particular trail. It was a trail that took you through the prayer rocks of the Hupa and Yurok tribes. Being in the Trinity Alps, obviously, we were really high up. We started at about 5,000 feet and maybe went up another 1,000. The trail was about 10 or 12 miles long and split about 3 miles south of Red Cap Lake. One trail took you down into one of the many gorgeous, secluded valleys in the Alps. The other took you to a point. Literally, the end of the trail was on a point that extended out quite a few feet from the true edge of the cliff. At that point, we were about 2,000 feet above the forest below us, so we were very remote. In the meadow, our first night there, we split into 2 groups trying to find the best camp spot. Really not hard to do. The meadow was just about twice the size of a football field. Half was all knee-high green grass. The entire west side of the meadow was a small lake. You could catch pan-sized trout all day long in that little lake. Now, our meadow was off the main trail which rode the peaks of the mountains we were on. You walked down into this meadow from the north end, and as you walked, you got a bird's eye view of the entire area. At the south end of the meadow was an extremely rocky cliff that rose above the lake about 200 to 300 feet, with the forest ending right at the edge at the top. So now you understand the area a little as I tell this story. We were just finishing our nightly session to end the day around the campfire. Both campsites were at the south end of the grass near the rocks, not far from one another. Everybody had just grown quiet as we all were drifting off to sleep. Suddenly, there was this god-awful screaming, howling-like noise that echoed through the meadow to make it sound like the screaming was coming from all directions. And for what seemed to be forever, the strange noise finally stopped and was followed up by one of the trees at the top of the rock cliff getting pushed off. I swear that tree must have hit every single rock that was in its path on the way down. And as it grew closer, the more petrified I became due to its sounding like it was right on top of our camp. Finally, the crashing noise came to a stop without ever landing on someone's tent. I still couldn't move, though. I was frozen position, and seeing the brightest shade of yellow I've ever seen. I think the others were too. Nobody wanted to come out of their tents, but everybody wanted the reassurance of the others. The rest of the night was uneventful. The next morning we were all around the campfire, sounding like a bunch of old biddies gossiping about the night before. We found the tree that came down. It was a full-grown fir. Must have been a full-size tree when it started down the cliff. Wasn't much left of it when it got to the bottom. I have never heard that strange scream since, and have been back in the woods plenty. None of us could come up with a reasonable explanation for what we heard that night. Shortly thereafter, we were joined by a guide who was Native American. This guide informed us that the prayer rocks I wrote about earlier are on sacred ground, and it is believed that there is a Bigfoot protecting that whole mountain. The guide also went on to say that the noise has been heard before, but in other places. We discussed how big of a creature it would take to push over a full-grown pine or fir tree. We know it wasn't a bear, unless bears are coming up with horrifying new screams. So, it wasn't a bear, but it had to be big and strong. The tree circumference was about 4, maybe 5 feet. And we concluded from memory of seeing the tree, it was about 50 feet tall and very much alive. At least the parts we were looking at came from a live tree. Nobody would climb up the easy rocky cliff to see where the tree used to be located, so I couldn't tell you if there were any footprints or not. But I can say that this story was backburnered in my memory to tell at the campfires for our entertainment. It became very interesting when I heard one of many documentaries about this screaming, howling-like noise that the Bigfoot has been known to make. When I heard that, all of a sudden, that night needed to be shared. This is the end of this story. Story number 4. August 2007, Lake Tahoe, Placer County, California. Tracks found 18 inches long, 9 inches wide. I was camping last August with my nephew north of Lake Tahoe. We had been in a moderately developed campground, Crystal Peak Overlook, about 20 miles northwest of Reno, Nevada, where we live. There, my nephew made friends with another little boy, and I started talking to the other little boy's grandmother. She told me how her husband and son had found these Bigfoot prints that May along a creek above another nearby campground, Dog Valley Creek. They reported that in one print they could even make out separate toe tracks. They told a ranger, who gave them some plastic tape to mark the spot. That got me curious, so we moved camp the next day to Dog Valley, a primitive campground. This is on the dry side of the Sierras at the timberline, which is about 6,000 feet. Generally, the granite soil of the Sierras doesn't sustain much vegetation, but in this area several small streams converge to make a marshy pasture with a lot of biodiversity. We hiked up the creek that flows through the campground. It was a moderately steep climb. About 100 yards up, I spotted the bits of tape tied to sticks stuck in the ground in a particularly thick patch of trees. The forest floor was covered with pine needles, but you could still see the depressed area of the prints sunk in the soil beneath leaves. In August, when we were there, even I, at over 200 pounds, didn't leave a footprint. But perhaps in May, in the deep shade, the ground had been muddy enough to take tracks. There were 3 prints marked out, but only one was still the outline of a full foot. However, I could no longer make out any separate toe impressions. It was about 18 inches long and nearly 9 inches wide. All the pictures I took came out pretty useless. Only the one where I put my bare foot in the tracks gives you any idea of size. The area is about 20 miles from human habitation, but gets maybe a dozen people a week off-roading during June through October. The roads to the area aren't cleared in the winter, so there's hardly anyone there until May. The area is in the rain shadow of the high Sierra Peak, so even in winter there's probably less than a couple feet of snow, and it has lots of springs. I'd guess this area would have edible vegetation, if not all winter, at least very early in the spring. This area is not too far south of the Cascade Range, where there are more Sasquatch reports, and might be the sort of area a species might migrate south to for the winter. My nephew asked if the footprint could be made by a really tall person, like a basketball player, so when I got home I did some net research. 18 inches would be a shoe size, 26, many E's. The nearest I found was a guy 8'4" who wears a size 25. There are less than a dozen people in the USA that tall, and most use canes or crutches and wouldn't be up to a barefoot hike in the mountains. I don't have a scanner, but I'll see if I can find a friend to scan the one halfway decent photo to you. Yes, I did have a camera, but it was a little 35mm disposable, and the footprint I found is hard to make out, and the markings on the measuring tape I had in one picture can't even be made out at all. There may have been 3 prints, but only one was clear enough to be a definite footprint. Gina Bagney. Date Friday, 1st of February, 2008. That's the end of story number 4. This next story is entitled Wichita County, Arkansas, 1940s. I am 75 years old. I was raised in the county of Wichita in Arkansas. We used to hear Bigfoots during winter time. Dad says they were panthers. Till Dad and his brother saw 5 Bigfoots in a pool of water at a river bottom. My uncle never got over that shock and would not go into the woods again. Dad said they were ugly, and the females had breasts that hung down to here, pointing to his body. I recall laying in that broad shack. It was cold, listening to them scream and scream, and they did a lot. When I was all of 5 years old, my dad was out running trapline and doing some farming in the summertime. It was at this time that our canned goods began to go missing from our smokehouse. One time, whole smoked ham disappeared. We could not figure out who was taking the food. My dad told Mother that he thought someone or something was following him when he was out running his trap lines. One day he spotted someone. The little fellow was about 4.5 feet tall, with hair all over him. It also had a hump back and was very ugly in the face, which had facial hair. Dad began talking to it and leaving food for the little fellow. It wasn't long before, when my dad would go into the woods and holler, the little guy would suddenly appear. We named him Little Sam, which was a name my grandpa had. Nobody knew about Little Sam outside of our family. All those years, Dad was in touch with Little Sam. I only saw him 2 times in my childhood. After I got married and moved to Oklahoma, my mother wrote me and told me about Dad and little Sam, saying that they had not seen little Sam in some time, but they went looking for him and found him dead. When I was reading the letter, I started to cry. It was very sad. Little Sam never uttered a word that I heard about, but he grunted. This is the end of story number 5. This is story number 6. Wild Man in McHenry County, Velva, North Dakota, 1908. The Stevens Point Journal, Stevens Point, Wisconsin, Saturday, February 16th, 1908. Captured, a wild man. Curious find recently made at Velva, North Dakota. The journal is in receipt of a clipping from a Velva, North Dakota paper from J. Thomas, who is formerly a resident of Keene, a son of Mrs. John Thomas, who still lives at Keene. It relates to the discovery of an alleged wild man near Velva, not far from Mr. Thomas's home. It is stated, for 3 years there have been rumors of this wild man being seen by persons of veracity, but he had never been encountered at close range until a few days ago, when 2 cattlemen who were out hunting suddenly came upon him face to face as he emerged from a thicket of brush. One of them succeeded in throwing a lasso around him, and before he could escape, he was dragged to a tree and bound round and round with the lasso. Later he was bound hand and foot and carried to town on a dray, where he was imprisoned in a basement. His only clothing was a loin girdle of sheepskin tied with binder twine. He had not been shaved or had a haircut in years, and being a man of an extremely hairy variety, he presented a very grotesque and wild appearance. His eye teeth are reported to be unnaturally elongated in the form of tusks. He refused to talk or eat anything, but drank water like a horse, half a pail at a time. The singular part of it is that this man has always been seen within 2 miles of the village of Velva. This is the end of story number 6. Story number 7. Montgomery County, Arkansas, June 2008. On May 26, 2008, while the writer was in Clark County, Alabama, with area researchers, information was received by telephone from CK, an Arkansas RFP research project investigator, that a married couple in the rural Montgomery County, Arkansas, had found evidence and had heard sounds that indicated more than one reclusive forest primate was foraging on their property at night. That information had been submitted to CK by the adult son of the woman who is joint owner and resident of the property. On June 7, 2008, CK and the property owner's son and the writer drove to the site and met with the couple. We arrived about 3 o'clock p.m. and left shortly after 11 o'clock p.m. The couple are in their late 40s and both have daytime employment in Hot Springs. They have purchased a 16-acre tract of land in Montgomery County and plan to build a home on it later. The north side of the property slopes to a small spring-fed creek. That hillside and the creek bottoms below are densely forested with various hardwoods, pine and cedar. The underbrush has been cleared from the area of the planned home site. Along the creek there is a very thick undergrowth of vines and brush. The land south of the creek was at one time cultivated, but it is now overgrown in brush, vines, and small trees through which trails have been cut with a bush hog. Throughout the property there is a prolific growth of muscadine, summer grape, and blackberry vines. There are at least 2 pear trees in the old cultivated area, although the one seen by the writer appears to be ornamental Bradford pear. A neighbor told them that he had gathered pears from one of the trees. Earlier this year, the owners obtained utilities on the property and in late February or early March they opened a driveway through the timber on the north portion of the property. In late February of this year, they purchased a new travel trailer and installed it about 75 yards from the county road that is the northern boundary of the property. General information about the area. The actual location of the property is not disclosed at the owner's request. The property is within 2 miles of a river which is a popular stream for canoeing and wade fishing. The site is within the foothills of the relatively small but rugged Caddo Mountains, which adjoin the southern flank of the Wichita Mountains. The area contains a large population of deer, turkey, and raccoon. The area has some cougar and no doubt many bobcat. A large male cougar was reportedly killed within 1/2 mile of the property a short time ago. During this initial visit to the site, the writer noted a very fresh cougar track in the dust alongside the county road near the home where a wide, well-used game trail crosses the county road. While the area is expected to contain all the other small animals and birds common to this part of the state, it was surprising that no coyote sign was seen around the property, and when asked, the owner said they had never heard coyotes in the area. Summary of events. After moving into the travel trailer, the owners built a wooden porch patio underneath the trailer's retractable awning. While neither of the residents are hunters and neither own a firearm, they are both avid bird and animal watchers. They have installed feeders for birds and began putting out dog food and scraps for the raccoons. For some time the couple had been spreading corn on the ground in a spot in the woods in front, east of the trailer, and at another location on the opposite side of the trailer as food for the deer. Sometime after they started putting out corn for the deer, they found a carcass of a deer near the west side feeding area. The witnesses stated that one of the deer's front legs and its head had been torn off. The head was found a few yards away, but the leg was partially eaten nearby. Both of the deer's back legs were broken, and much of its hind quarters had been eaten before the carcass was found. They stated the deer's body cavity and stomach had been torn open, and the internal organs had been removed. There was undigested corn and corn mush inside the body cavity and spilled outside the carcass. When the carcass was again viewed the next day, they saw fresh blood and an exposed shoulder blade, which indicated something had fed on the carcass overnight. A week or so later, another deer carcass was found at the other baiting site in front of the trailer. Both of the deer's back legs were broken, and the carcass torn open and partially consumed. Shortly after finding the last deer carcass, the couple stopped putting out corn because they thought a cougar was ambushing the deer at the baiting locations. A day or two later, the couple found an injured dog lying beside the porch early one morning. They don't own a dog. When they stepped outside, the dog managed to get up and walk away, but there was a large bloody area on the ground where it had been lying. Shortly after seeing the injured dog, they found out that another dog, a Rottweiler weighing close to 200 pounds and belonging to the neighbor, had been attacked or otherwise injured. Something had torn off one of that dog's back legs. According to the couple, the dog somehow managed to return to his owner's home and still was alive. The couple said that now the large dog usually just stays on the porch and will no longer leave the owner's yard. Investigators note, when CK and the woman's son and this writer were leaving the couple's home site and driving through the woods road toward the county road the night of the initial meeting, CK, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, told me there was a deer in the woods on my side of the vehicle. I stopped and saw an animal that I at first thought was a coyote moving through the woods. As I entered a more open spot, we saw that it was a large dog. We then drove away. The next night, about 8:30 p.m., the property owner called to tell me that when he went outside early that morning, he found a dog badly injured at the old baiting site east of the trailer. He said that it appeared the dog's back or its hips had been broken. He said at the time that he did not think that the dog would survive. although he said the dog managed to drag itself away the next morning. From his description of the dog, it was the same one that the three of us had seen the night before. Shortly after finding the deer carcasses, the husband spoke to a neighbor about any strange things that had occurred on the neighbor's property. The neighbor reportedly told him that 5 of his sheep had been killed and ripped apart inside an enclosure. When asked what he thought had killed the sheep, the neighbor said he thought it was dogs because he found some type of terrier inside the enclosure when he found the dead sheep. The couple stated that they had often sat outside on the patio porch at night and early in the morning during the week. He arises about 4:30 a.m. on weekdays to make coffee, and she joins him outside for a few minutes later. They both leave for work about 5 a.m. They stated that on many occasions when they stepped outside before daylight, they would hear the sounds of something crashing through the woods and brush near the trailer. They assumed it was deer bounding away, although they thought it was odd that deer would make such noise leaving the area. They said that on several occasions they had heard loud ape or monkey-like sounds from the adjoining woods while sitting outside late in the evening and at night. Recently, it became apparent to them that at times the sounds were being made by more than one animal. A few weeks ago, a relative found a very large, about 18 inches long, track in a fire ant hill near the creek. The residents found another such track in one of their small vegetable gardens located northeast of the trailer. On the day of this initial visit, the writer observed 2 recently made tracks of about the same approximate size in the leaves and soil west of the trailer. The property owners also reported that some of the suet blocks used to feed birds were torn down and removed. They supposed that raccoons had taken the food, even though the couple thought they had suspended the blocks out of the reach of those animals. The husband began using wire to secure the door of the wire suet baskets so that raccoons could not open them if they managed to get them. Although the wife stated she could not open the baskets with her hands after her husband wired them shut, something continued to tear the baskets down and open them to obtain and consume the suet blocks. Recently, the couple began putting up hummingbird feeders. 2 of the feeders are small, but one holds about a quart of sugared water. A few nights ago, when the large feeder was nearly full, something reached the feeder and drank the entire contents except for some spillage that coated the outside surface of the container. The feeder was elevated and suspended away from a tree trunk on an L bracket. Because of the position of the container and its capacity, the couple thinks it is unlikely that raccoons emptied it, although they concede that a raccoon might have been responsible. Other details. While completing this initial report, the writer telephoned the reporting witnesses at 8:40 p.m. on June 10th to ask about a few details. After clarifying the details, the husband asked if he could pose a question to me. When I told him that of course he could, he asked if I had ever heard whooping-type sounds, which he began to imitate over the phone. The sounds he made were nearly identical to the whooping sounds attributed to the reclusive forest primates. When I told him the possible source of the sounds, he said that both he and his wife had heard those sounds about 20 minutes earlier, coming from the opposite side of the creek and downstream. After some discussion, he said that he might go onto the porch and make those sounds to see what would happen. I advised him to be extra careful because the animals might be much closer than when he heard them originally. This is the end of this collection of stories. Thank you for listening.
My name is Martin Elliott. The incident occurred when I was about 10 or 11 years old, so in 1972 or 1973. At the time, I lived in Puyallup, Washington, in the South Hill area, Shaw Road, near a housing development called Forest Green. When this occurred, myself, my stepbrother, and a neighborhood friend whose name I can't remember, we were just out playing in the woods. My friend, my stepbrother, and myself were playing in an area off of a dirt road approximately half a mile off of Shaw Road near the Kate Dairy Farm pasture. We went up into this dirt road about a half mile up and went into some trees that we had an area that we like to consider our camp, that had some downed trees, and it wasn't far off the road. We were sitting there, just as kids do, playing and stuff, and we heard a sound that sounded to myself like a lady screaming, or a baby, cry out. It was just one loud cry. That was it. We talked about it, and we thought, what was that? And the friend that was with us said, well, maybe it was a horse from the pasture? I said, that doesn't sound like a horse. Well, maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, we got this smell started coming around us, and it smelled like, burnt match heads or rotten eggs, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. And we were still sitting there, and towards the roadside near the trees that we were at, about 7 to 8 feet into the trees, the tree limbs pushed aside, and there, standing before us, was a Bigfoot, a sasquatch. We basically just froze and stared at it for it seemed like forever. But I know that it was about probably 30 seconds before we panicked and took off running. All 3 of us ran as fast as we could back to our house. He ran back to his house, and me and my stepbrother ran back to our house. After that, we had told our parents about it, and we were pretty panic-stricken about it. We told our parents about it, and my mom at the time worked at the Daffodil Bowling Alley in Puyallup, and she and my stepfather were talking at the coffee shop about the incident and were telling their friends. A couple of gentlemen walked up and said, "Excuse me, we are from the University of Oregon. We are here in town doing some Bigfoot research, and would you feel okay with us coming and interviewing your son?" They said, "Sure, no problem." They came up to our house, and we sat at the dining room table where they basically interviewed me about the situation, about what had happened, showed me some sketches, and asked me if this is what it looked like or if that is what it looked like. Had me describe the scent, and had me listen to tape recordings, and said, well, did it sound like this tape recording or like that tape recording? And so they did a pretty extensive interview. They felt at the time that we were not pranking them, so that was the extent of it. If I can describe the best description I have for the creature that I saw, he or she or it was, I would say, 7.5 to 8 feet tall. It had a brown-black hair that was probably 3 to 4 inches long, covering, its whole body except for its hands. And I really didn't look at its feet. I just saw its hands because of the way it held the branches back. Its face was a kind of cross between an Aboriginal Australian and a gorilla. That's the easiest way I can describe it. It made no attempt at all to chase us or anything. It just watched us. It just looked at us. So basically that's my story. It's been a situation where I talked about it when I was a kid. Everybody thought I was an idiot, thought I was crazy, so it was something that, through most of my life, I really don't tell anybody about. It's not something that I ever really tell anyone. But at the time, around that area, after our sighting, there was quite a bit of activity in the Puyallup area, and so I hope this is helpful to you, and feel free to contact me if you have any more questions. Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open.